Everett Holloway's rise to success was a testament to his unwavering ambition and sharp intellect. Born to middle-class parents, he had always possessed a keen understanding of numbers and a drive to prove himself. After graduating from the University of Minnesota with a degree in finance, Everett quickly climbed the corporate ladder at Pinnacle Investments, one of Minneapolis's most prestigious financial firms. By the age of 35, Everett had become the youngest partner in the firm's history, known for his shrewd investment strategies and ability to close even the most challenging deals. His corner office on the 40th floor of the Pinnacle Tower offered a panoramic view of the city he had conquered, a daily reminder of how far he had come. Colleagues described Everett as brilliant but ruthless, a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. Alana Holloway had once harbored dreams as vivid and colorful as the canvases she loved to paint. The daughter of a renowned art professor at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, Alana had shown promise as an artist from a young age. Her abstract paintings, with their bold strokes and emotive use of color, had garnered attention in local galleries during her college years. However, the practical concerns of adult life had slowly eroded her artistic aspirations. After marrying Everett at 24, Alana found herself swept up in the world of corporate wives, charity galas, and country club memberships. Her paint-stained jeans and eclectic studio apartment were replaced by designer dresses and a showcase home in Maple Grove. While she still painted occasionally, her works now adorned the walls of their home rather than gallery spaces, a constant reminder of the path not taken. To the outside world, the Holloways were the epitome of success. Their annual Christmas parties were the talk of the neighborhood. Everett and Alana moved through social circles with ease, he with his sharp wit, and she with her warm smile and effortless charm. They were fixtures at charity events, always ready with a generous donation and a quotable soundbite for the local press. Yet behind closed doors, the cracks in their relationship were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Everett's long hours at the office and frequent business trips left Alana feeling isolated and unfulfilled. She yearned for the passion and creativity of her youth, feelings that seemed increasingly distant in the face of endless social obligations and the pressure to maintain their immaculate image. For his part, Everett found himself growing frustrated with what he perceived as Alana's lack of ambition. He couldn't understand why she wasn't content with the life he had provided, why she still clung to her hobby of painting, when she could be networking with other corporate wives or involving herself in more prestigious charitable causes. Dominic Reeves had always been a man caught between two worlds. Raised in a blue-collar family in North Minneapolis, he had learned the value of hard work from an early age, helping his father with plumbing jobs on weekends and during summer breaks. His natural aptitude for the trade, combined with his father's tutelage, had made him one of the most sought-after plumbers in the Twin Cities by his late 20s. But Dominic possessed another gift, one that seemed at odds with the gritty nature of his chosen profession. Blessed with chiseled features, piercing green eyes, and a physique honed by years of physical labor, Dominic had the looks of a model straight out of a fashion magazine. It was a passing comment from a satisfied customer, the wife of a local talent agent, that led Dominic to explore this other side of himself. Soon, Dominic found himself living a double life. By day, he donned work boots and carried a toolbox, expertly navigating the intricacies of pipes and fixtures. By night and on weekends, he slipped into designer clothes and struck poses for cameras, his image gracing local billboards and magazine ads. It was on a sweltering Tuesday in June when Dominic first crossed paths with Alana Holloway. A routine call about a leaky faucet brought him to the house. As Alana opened the door, Dominic was struck by her natural beauty. As Dominic worked on the faucet, the two fell into easy conversation. Alana, starved for intellectual stimulation, was surprised and delighted by Dominic's knowledge of art. He spoke passionately about a recent exhibit he had seen at the Walker Art Center, his eyes lighting up as he described the interplay of light and shadow in the paintings. For the first time in years, Alana felt truly seen and heard. As Dominic packed up his tools, their eyes met, and a spark of connection passed between them. Little did either of them know that this chance encounter would set in motion a series of events that would irrevocably alter the course of their lives. In the weeks following their initial encounter, Alana found herself inventing reasons to call Dominic back to the house. A stubborn clog in the guest bathroom, a mysterious knocking in the pipes, a sudden need to update the fixtures in the powder room. Each issue, no matter how trivial, became an excuse to see the handsome plumber again. Dominic, for his part, was all too happy to oblige. He found himself looking forward to these service calls more than any modeling gig or high-paying plumbing job. Their conversations during these visits grew longer and more personal. Alana confided in Dominic about her abandoned dreams of becoming an artist, while he shared stories of his struggles to balance his two careers and find his place in the world. One afternoon, as Dominic was finishing up some work on the main floor bathroom, Alana invited him to see her art studio, a converted sunroom that Everett had grudgingly allowed her to use for her hobby. As they stood surrounded by her canvases, some finished and others works in progress, Dominic was struck by the raw emotion evident in her brushstrokes. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand, telling her how talented she was and how she shouldn't give up on her dreams. The touch of his hand sent current through Alana's body. Before either of them fully realized what was happening, they were in each other's arms, years of pent-up longing and desire pouring out in a passionate kiss. From that moment, Alana and Dominic's relationship evolved into a full-blown affair. They seized every opportunity to be together, their encounters a heady mix of physical passion and emotional connection. Dominic would arrive under the guise of performing routine maintenance, and Alana would lead him to her studio, where they would lose themselves in each other's embrace. As the weeks turned into months, their relationship deepened. Dominic encouraged Alana to start painting again in earnest, and she found herself rediscovering her love for art. But their happiness was always tinged with the knowledge that what they were doing was wrong. Alana was racked with guilt over betraying Everett, even as she acknowledged to herself that their marriage had been emotionally over for years. Dominic struggled with his role as the other man, his working-class background making him feel like he could never truly be a part of Alana's world. Their affair was a dangerous dance of close calls and near misses. There was the time Everett came home early from work, forcing Dominic to hide in a closet for over an hour. Another instance saw them having to hastily rearrange Alana's studio when a neighbor dropped by unexpectedly. Each close call added to the thrill of their forbidden romance, but also served as a stark reminder of the precarious nature of their situation. As summer began to wane, both Alana and Dominic knew that things couldn't continue as they were. Something would have to give. Alana had begun to tentatively broach the subject of leaving Everett, while Dominic found himself daydreaming about a future where he and Alana could be together openly. Neither of them could have predicted the tragic turn their story was about to take, or the devastating consequences that awaited them on that fateful day in July. July 15, 2023, dawned bright and oppressively hot, the kind of summer day where the air shimmered with heat and the pavement could fry an egg. Everett Holloway was in New York, scheduled to close a major deal that would cement his status as Pinnacle Investments' top performer. Alana, believing she had the house to herself for the next 2 days, had invited Dominic over under the pretense of checking the air conditioning system. As Dominic's battered work truck pulled into the Holloway's driveway at 10 a.m., Alana felt the familiar flutter of excitement in her stomach. She had spent extra time on her appearance that morning, putting on a flowing sundress that Dominic had once complimented and dabbing on the perfume he loved. When she opened the door, Dominic's appreciative gaze made her feel more alive than she had in years. They barely made it to the studio before falling into each other's arms, their kisses urgent and passionate. As clothes were shed and hands roamed familiar territory, neither of them heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Everett Holloway was furious. The New York deal had fallen through at the last minute due to a competitor's unexpected maneuver. Facing the prospect of returning to Minneapolis empty-handed and potentially losing his shot at a promotion, Everett had decided to fly home immediately, his mind racing with ways to salvage the situation. As he turned onto the house, his anger simmered, needing only the slightest provocation to boil over. The sight of the plumber's truck in his driveway was that provocation. Everett had never liked the idea of strange men in his house while he was away, and he had specifically told Alana to hold off on any repairs until he returned. Slamming his car door, he stormed towards the house, ready to give both his wife and this presumptuous tradesman a piece of his mind. The scene that greeted Everett as he burst into Alana's studio would be forever seared into his memory. His wife, her sundress hitched up around her waist, was straddling a shirtless man on the chaise lounge they had bought in Paris on their 5th anniversary. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as 3 pairs of eyes locked in a tableau of shock, horror, and dawning realization. Alana was the first to move, scrambling off Dominic with a strangled cry of Everett's name. Dominic, his face a mask of guilt and fear, reached for his discarded shirt. But Everett was faster. With a roar of rage, he launched himself at Dominic, his fists connecting with against the younger man's face. What happened next was a blur of violence and desperation. Dominic, despite his superior physical condition, was at a disadvantage, caught off guard and reluctant to fight back against his lover's husband. Everett, fueled by rage and humiliation, seemed to possess inhuman strength. He pummeled Dominic relentlessly, oblivious to Alana's screams and pleas for him to stop. In the chaos, the two men stumbled and crashed into Alana's paintings. Canvases fell, easels toppled, and art supplies went flying. A heavy marble sculpture, a wedding gift from Everett's parents, teetered on its pedestal before crashing down onto Dominic's head with a sickening crack. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. Dominic lay motionless on the paint-splattered floor, blood pooling around his head like a macabre halo. Everett stood over him, his knuckles bloody, chest heaving as the red mist of rage slowly cleared from his vision. Alana, her sundress torn and stained, stared at the scene before her in mute horror. Alana dialed 911, her voice breaking as she tried to explain what had happened. Everett, having washed the blood from his hands, sat in his home office staring blankly at the wall until the police arrived. The detectives had no idea about the plot twist that is about to emerge. The quiet of Maple Grove was shattered by the wail of sirens as police cars and an ambulance. Neighbors emerged from their homes, gathering in small clusters to whisper and speculate as they watched the grim procession of emergency vehicles. By nightfall, the Holloway residence was a hive of activity. Crime scene technicians combed through the studio, cataloging evidence and taking photographs. Detectives interviewed a stone-faced Everett and a distraught Alana in separate rooms. And in the center of it all, Dominic Reeves's body lay covered by a sheet, waiting to be transported to the medical examiner's office. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of police activity and neighborhood gossip. Detective Liana Ortiz, a veteran of the police department's homicide unit, was assigned as the lead investigator on the case. Known for her meticulous attention to detail and unwavering dedication to the truth, Ortiz approached the Holloway case with a determination to uncover every facet of the tragic event. As she pieced together the timeline of that fateful day, Ortiz found herself faced with a complex web of conflicting statements and circumstantial evidence. The 911 call made by Alana at 11:23 a.m. was brief and hysterical, with the distraught woman barely able to articulate what had happened. Everett's call, placed just 2 minutes later, was eerily calm as he reported an accident at his home. Neighbor testimonies painted a picture of an ordinary summer morning suddenly disrupted. Beatrice Lundquist, the 78-year-old retiree who lived across the street, reported seeing Dominic's truck arrive around 10 a.m., noting that it wasn't unusual as the handsome plumber had been a frequent visitor over the past few months. It was Beatrice who also witnessed Everett's unexpected return, remarking on his aggressive driving as he pulled into the driveway. Another neighbor was mowing his lawn when he heard what he described as a commotion coming from the Holloway residence. While he couldn't make out specific words, he recalled hearing a man's angry shouts and a woman's screams. Terrified, he had retreated into his house and debated calling the police before the sirens announced their arrival. The crime scene itself was a study in chaos. The once pristine studio was now a jumble of overturned furniture, shattered art pieces, and splattered paint. Flood spatter analysis indicated a violent struggle, with Dominic's blood found not only around his body, but also on several surfaces throughout the room. Hose damming was the marble sculpture, its base stained red, which the medical examiner would later confirm as the weapon that delivered the fatal blow. Alana, still in shock, provided a fragmented account of the events. She admitted to the affair with Dominic, but insisted that Everett's attack was unprovoked and that she had begged him to stop. Her torn dress and bruised arms seemed to corroborate a struggle, though it was unclear whether these injuries came from Everett or from her attempts to intervene in the fight. Everett, on the other hand, maintained a stance of self-defense. In his statement, he claimed to have found Dominic attacking Alana and had intervened to protect his wife. He expressed remorse for Dominic's death, but insisted he had only been trying to subdue the younger man. However, the lack of defensive wounds on Everett and the extent of Dominic's injuries cast doubt on this version of events. The autopsy report, delivered 3 days after the incident, provided grim details of Dominic's final moments. In addition to the fatal wound, his body showed evidence of multiple blunt force traumas, consistent with a severe beating. The report also noted defensive wounds on Dominic's arms and hands, suggesting he had tried to protect himself from the onslaught. As Detective Ortiz dug deeper, she uncovered a trail of text messages and emails between Alana and Dominic, documenting the evolution of their relationship from innocent flirtation to full-blown affair. Financial records showed a series of cash withdrawals from Alana's personal account, coinciding with dates of Dominic's visits, hinting at possible payments for services beyond plumbing. With each new piece of evidence, the case against Everett Holloway grew stronger. Yet Ortiz couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than a simple crime of passion. As she prepared to present her findings to the district attorney, the seasoned detective knew that this case would be far from straightforward, and that the truth, when finally revealed, might be more complex and disturbing than anyone in Maple Grove could have imagined. Everett was charged with second-degree murder, a decision that sparked debate among legal experts. Some argued that the charge should have been first-degree murder, given the brutal nature of the attack. Others contended that the circumstances warranted a lesser charge of manslaughter. District Attorney Clarissa Nguyen defended the decision, stating that the charge reflected both the severity of the crime and the heat-of-the-moment nature of the confrontation. Everett's defense team, led by attorney Jerome Hoffman, crafted a narrative of a loving husband driven to temporary insanity by the shock of his wife's betrayal. They planned to argue that Everett had acted in the heat of passion, a strategy aimed at reducing the charges to manslaughter. Alana found herself in an impossible position. As the only witness to the crime, her testimony would be crucial. The prosecution pressed her to testify against Everett, while his defense team implied that her future financial security might depend on supporting her husband's version of events. It was during this process that a series of unexpected revelations came to light, adding layers of complexity to an already intricate case. The first bombshell dropped when an anonymous tip led Detective Ortiz to dig into Dominic Reeves's past. What she uncovered was far from the simple story of a working-class plumber moonlighting as a model. Dominic, it turned out, had a juvenile record that had been sealed upon his 18th birthday. With a judge's permission, Ortiz accessed the files and discovered that as a teenager, Dominic had been involved in a sophisticated identity theft ring. He had avoided serious charges by turning state's witness against the ringleaders, but the incident revealed a cunning and potentially manipulative side to the man who had been painted as an innocent victim. Further investigation into Dominic's adult life revealed a pattern of relationships with wealthy, married women across the Twin Cities. Bank records showed regular cash deposits, far exceeding what he could have earned from his plumbing and modeling work. The defense team seized upon this information, beginning to construct a narrative of Dominic as a calculated conman who had targeted Alana as his next mark. What made this discovery even more shocking was the apparent connection to Dominic Reeves. One of the shell companies used in the embezzlement scheme was registered to an address that had once been Dominic's residence. This unexpected link between the victim and the financial crimes of the accused threw both the prosecution and defense into turmoil, raising questions about whether Dominic's presence in the Holloway home had been more than just a romantic entanglement. As news of these discoveries began to leak to the press, the public narrative around the case shifted dramatically. The story of a simple love triangle gone wrong evolved into a complex tale of financial misdeeds, possible blackmail, and long-held secrets. Speculation ran rampant. Had Dominic discovered Everett's embezzlement and been using it to blackmail him? Was Alana somehow involved in the financial scheme? Had Everett's unexpected return home interrupted more than just an affair? Amidst this whirlwind of new information, Alana Holloway found herself under increased scrutiny. Her initial portrayal as either a victim or a cheating wife was replaced by questions about her potential complicity in her husband's financial crimes. Investigators revisited her background, paying particular attention to her abandoned art career and the timing of her marriage to Everett. It was an old college friend of Alana's, now an art dealer in Chicago, who provided another piece of the puzzle. She came forward with information about a promising young artist named Alana Prescott, who had abruptly disappeared from the art scene a decade ago, right around the time Alana had married Everett. The dealer produced a catalog from a student exhibition featuring Alana's work. abstract paintings that bore a striking resemblance to several pieces found in Everett's office at Pinnacle Investments. This led to a startling theory. Had Alana's art been used as a vehicle for money laundering, the large sums paid for her paintings could have provided a perfect cover for cleaning the embezzled funds. If true, it would mean that Alana's abandonment of her art career might not have been about sacrificing her dreams for marriage, but a calculated move to protect a criminal enterprise. As these revelations came to light, the strategies of both the prosecution and defense had to be drastically revised. What had once seemed like a straightforward, if tragic, case of passion and violence had transformed into a complex web of deceit, financial crime, and potential conspiracy. In the eye of this storm, Everett Holloway maintained his stoic demeanor, revealing nothing. Alana, on the other hand, became increasingly agitated, her composed facade crumbling under the weight of the accusations and insinuations. And hovering over it all was the specter of Dominic Reeves, the charismatic plumber, whose death had set this entire chain of events in motion, and whose true role in the Holloway saga remained shrouded in mystery. As the trial approached, one thing became clear. The truth, when finally revealed in the courtroom, would be far stranger and more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The trial of Everett Holloway began on a crisp autumn morning, the courthouse steps crowded with reporters and curious onlookers. Inside, the tension was palpable as Judge Miranda Flores called the court to order. The prosecution, led by D.A. Nguyen, opened with a powerful statement, painting Everett as a man driven to violence by his need for control, both in his personal life and his financial dealings. Defense attorney Hoffman countered with a narrative of Everett as a victim himself, of betrayal by his wife, and of manipulation by the deceased Dominic Reeves. He hinted at revelations that would shed new light on the events leading up to that fatal day in July. As the trial progressed, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Forensic experts detailed the brutal nature of the attack on Dominic, while financial analysts unraveled the complex web of Everett's alleged embezzlement scheme. Former colleagues from Pinnacle Investments spoke of Everett's ruthless business practices and volatile temper. The testimony of Alana Holloway was highly anticipated, and it did not disappoint. Over 2 grueling days on the stand, Alana's composed exterior crumbled as she was confronted with evidence of her potential involvement in the financial crimes. In a dramatic moment, she broke down and admitted to using her art to launder money, but insisted that she had been coerced by Everett, painting a picture of a controlling and abusive relationship. The defense's cross-examination was equally intense, forcing Alana to admit to her affair with Dominic and suggesting that she had been aware of his criminal past. The implication that she and Dominic had been conspiring to blackmail Everett hung in the air, unanswered. After 3 days of intense deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Everett Holloway was found guilty of second-degree manslaughter in the death of Dominic Reeves, a lesser charge than the prosecution had sought. Additionally, he was convicted on multiple counts of embezzlement and money laundering. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Alana Holloway, in a separate trial, pleaded guilty to lesser charges of financial fraud and received a suspended sentence and probation. She left Maple Grove shortly after, her whereabouts unknown to her former neighbors. The aftermath of the trial left the community of Maple Grove shaken. The picture-perfect facade of suburban life had been irreparably cracked, revealing the complex and often dark realities that can lurk behind closed doors. As for the truth about what really happened that fateful day in July, it remained elusive. Had Everett truly acted in a rage of passion? Or was it a calculated move to silence a potential blackmailer? Was Alana a victim of her husband's machinations, or a willing participant in a life of crime? And what of Dominic Reeves? Was he simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, or a key player in a complex conspiracy? In the end, the residents of Maple Grove were left to ponder these questions, their faith in the idyllic nature of their community forever altered. The case of the Holloways served as a stark reminder that beneath the tranquil surface of suburban life, turbulent waters may always be waiting to break free. Sabrina Brooks was known for her beauty and charm, qualities that had once captivated her husband, Robert. Their marriage seemed like a fairy tale, a perfect match that everyone admired. But the arrival of Robert's elderly mother, Miriam, into their home set off a chain of events that would end in unspeakable horror. Miriam was a frail but spirited woman, loved by her son and cherished by those who knew her. When Robert decided to bring her to live with them, he believed it was the right thing to do, a way to care for her in her twilight years. Sabrina, however, saw it differently. She viewed Miriam as an intruder, a threat to her domestic bliss. As tensions escalated, Sabrina's resentment turned to desperation. In a moment of madness, she concocted a deadly plan to rid herself of the woman she blamed for her misery. What followed was a chilling tale of premeditated murder, a crime that would leave an indelible mark on all who were touched by it. Sabrina and Robert's relationship began like a whirlwind romance. They met at a friend's wedding, where Robert, a successful architect, was immediately smitten by Sabrina's grace and vivacity. She worked as a freelance product photographer, and her creative spirit matched well with Robert's structured approach to life. After a brief courtship, they married and settled into a beautiful home on the outskirts of town. Miriam Brooks had lived a full life. Widowed for nearly a decade, she maintained her independence in a modest house in town. Her health had begun to decline, and Robert, ever the dutiful son, felt it was his responsibility to care for her. Miriam had always been a nurturing presence in Robert's life, and he couldn't bear the thought of her being alone. Initially, Sabrina and Miriam got along well enough. Miriam was polite and grateful, and Sabrina, though slightly apprehensive, made an effort to welcome her mother-in-law. But as weeks turned into months, the strain of their living arrangement began to show. Miriam's constant presence disrupted the couple's privacy and routine, and Sabrina felt increasingly sidelined in her own home. Robert, caught between his wife and his mother, tried to balance their needs. He was patient and kind, hoping that time would ease the tension, but Sabrina's discontent only grew. She confided in her friends about the stress she was under, seeking advice on how to cope. Some suggested patience, while others hinted that Robert's loyalty to his mother might always overshadow his marriage. The situation worsened as Miriam's health declined further. She required more care and attention, which fell primarily on Sabrina during the day while Robert was at work. The constant demands wore on her, leading to frequent arguments with Robert. He, in turn, became defensive and frustrated, unable to understand why Sabrina couldn't be more accommodating. Sabrina's resentment festered, turning into a simmering rage. She felt trapped, her life overshadowed by an elderly woman who seemed to sap all the joy from her marriage. As her desperation grew, Sabrina's thoughts took a darker turn. She began to entertain the idea of a life without Miriam, envisioning the return of her once idyllic marriage. It was in these moments of bitterness and despair that the seeds of her deadly plan were sown. Robert's decision to bring Miriam into their home was not made lightly. He had seen his mother's health decline and knew she needed more support than he could provide from a distance. After long discussions with Sabrina, he convinced her that it was the best solution. Reluctantly, Sabrina agreed, though she harbored reservations about the impact on their marriage. The day Miriam moved in, Robert and Sabrina prepared a guest room with care. Robert was excited to have his mother close, and Sabrina, though uneasy, wanted to support her husband's decision. Miriam arrived with a few suitcases and a warm smile, grateful for her son's hospitality. In the beginning, the arrangement seemed manageable. Miriam was polite and tried not to impose. She kept to her room most of the time, reading or knitting, and joined the couple for meals and occasional outings. Robert was relieved to see his mother settled and safe, but Sabrina began to feel the strain almost immediately. Miriam's presence altered the dynamics of the household. Dinner conversations that once flowed easily between Sabrina and Robert now included Miriam's comments and stories. Robert's attention was divided, and Sabrina found herself missing the intimacy they once shared. The subtle shifts in their relationship gnawed at her, creating an undercurrent of resentment. The first major conflict arose over household routines. Miriam, accustomed to her way of doing things, often interfered with Sabrina's established methods. She would rearrange the kitchen, critique Sabrina's cooking, or offer unsolicited advice on housekeeping. Sabrina, who prided herself on running an efficient home, felt undermined and disrespected. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where Miriam had criticized Sabrina's choice of dessert, the couple had a heated argument. Robert, exhausted from work and the constant tension, defended his mother, insisting that Sabrina was overreacting. Sabrina, feeling betrayed and isolated, lashed out, accusing Robert of always taking his mother's side. The arguments became more frequent. Robert, torn between his love for his wife and his duty to his mother, struggled to keep the peace. He tried to mediate, suggesting compromises and asking both women to be more understanding. But the underlying issues remained unresolved, and the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly toxic. Sabrina's resentment deepened as she felt increasingly trapped in a situation she had never wanted. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor, and she confided in a few about the constant stress she was under. Some offered sympathy, others advised her to stand her ground, but none could offer a solution that seemed viable. As the days turned into weeks, the initial harmony gave way to a persistent tension that permeated every aspect of their lives. The once warm and inviting home became a battleground of unspoken grievances and simmering anger. Sabrina's frustration reached a boiling point, and she began to fantasize about drastic measures to reclaim her life. Little did she know, those dark thoughts would soon manifest into a chilling reality. The tension in the Brooks household continued to rise, seeping into every corner of their lives. Miriam, oblivious to the depth of Sabrina's resentment, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She believed that with time things would improve, but Sabrina's patience was wearing thin, and her anger became harder to conceal. One morning, Sabrina discovered that Miriam had reorganized the pantry. What seemed like a minor inconvenience to Robert felt like a personal affront to Sabrina. She stormed into the living room where Miriam was sitting, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "You can't just come in here and change everything. This is my house." Miriam looked up, startled. "I was only trying to help, dear. I didn't mean to upset you. It's not help when it's done without asking. You're just making things harder." Robert walked in just as Sabrina's voice rose, and he quickly stepped between them. "Sabrina, please calm down. She's just trying to help." Sabrina shot him a look of pure frustration. "You always take her side, Robert. I'm the one who has to deal with this every day." Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't about sides. We're a family. We need to work together." Despite Robert's attempts to mediate, the rift between Sabrina and Miriam grew wider. Sabrina started avoiding Miriam as much as possible, retreating to her studio to work on her graphic design projects. She found solace in her work, a temporary escape from the constant strain at home. But the escape was fleeting. Every time she left her studio, she was reminded of Miriam's presence. The small irritations accumulated, each one adding to the weight of her resentment. She began to dread coming home, the once safe haven now a source of continuous stress. Friends noticed the change in Sabrina. She became more withdrawn, her usual vibrant personality overshadowed by a constant undercurrent of tension. During a coffee outing with her close friend Julia, Sabrina finally opened up about the depth of her frustration. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Julia. She's everywhere all the time. It's like I'm living with a stranger in my own home." Julia listened sympathetically. "Have you talked to Robert about how you feel?" Sabrina let out a bitter laugh. "Talked? All we do is argue about her. He doesn't see how much it's affecting me. He just wants to keep the peace." Julia reached out and squeezed Sabrina's hand. "Maybe you need to take some time for yourself. Get away for a bit. Clear your head." Sabrina nodded, but deep down she knew that a temporary escape wouldn't solve her problems. The constant presence of Miriam in her home felt like a prison sentence, one she couldn't escape from. Her thoughts grew darker, and she began to entertain ideas she had once considered unthinkable. One night, as Sabrina lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought crossed her mind that made her shudder. What if Miriam wasn't here anymore? The idea lingered, gaining strength with each passing day. It was a forbidden thought, one that brought a sense of both horror and twisted relief. As the days turned into weeks, the seeds of a plan began to take root in Sabrina's mind. She started researching methods to make someone ill, initially out of morbid curiosity. But the more she read, the more the idea of poisoning Miriam seemed like a viable solution to her predicament. It would be quick, discreet, and if done correctly, could appear as a natural death. Sabrina's desperation clouded her judgment. She convinced herself that this was the only way to regain control of her life and salvage her marriage. The dark thoughts that had once seemed so alien now felt like a lifeline. Little did she know this decision would lead her down a path of no return, with consequences far beyond her darkest imaginings. Sabrina's desperation reached its peak as she found herself more isolated and overwhelmed by the day. The once loving and harmonious relationship with Robert now felt like a distant memory, replaced by constant arguments and mutual resentment. She began to see Miriam not as an innocent elderly woman, but as the embodiment of all her marital problems. Confiding in friends became a regular outlet for Sabrina's frustration. During a particularly emotional conversation with her friend Lisa, Sabrina's true feelings came to the surface. "I can't do this anymore, Lisa. Every day is a battle. I feel like I'm losing myself." Lisa looked concerned. "You need to find a way to cope, Sabrina. Maybe you should see a therapist or take some time away." Sabrina shook her head. "Therapy won't change anything. The problem is Miriam. As long as she's here, nothing will get better." Lisa hesitated, then spoke softly. "Have you thought about asking her to move out? Maybe she could go to a care facility where she'd get the help she needs." Sabrina's eyes darkened. "Robert would never agree to that. He's too loyal. He'd see it as abandoning her." Lisa sighed. "I'm worried about you, Sabrina. This isn't healthy. You need to do something before it's too late." Sabrina nodded absently, but her mind was already elsewhere. She had considered every possible solution and always came back to the same conclusion. Miriam had to go. The idea of poisoning her mother-in-law, once a fleeting thought, now seemed like the only viable option. Sabrina began to meticulously plan Miriam's demise. She spent hours researching poisons, focusing on substances that would be difficult to detect. Her background in graphic design gave her an eye for detail, and she applied this skill to her dark new project. She discovered that certain plants, when ingested in small doses over time, could cause symptoms resembling a natural illness. With a plan in place, Sabrina started the next phase, obtaining the poison. She chose aconite, a potent toxin found in monkshood plants. It was a risky choice, but one that could be easily masked in food. She ordered the seeds online, ensuring they were delivered to a friend's address to avoid suspicion. The seeds arrived a few days later, and Sabrina carefully cultivated them in a hidden corner of her garden. She tended to them with a mixture of dread and determination, knowing that each day brought her closer to executing her plan. The process took weeks, during which the tension in the house continued to escalate. Miriam's health, already fragile, began to show signs of further decline. She frequently complained of stomach pains and nausea, symptoms that Sabrina dismissed with a feigned concern. Robert, ever the devoted son, grew increasingly worried, suggesting doctor visits and tests to determine the cause. Sabrina played her part well, expressing appropriate levels of worry and support. She accompanied Miriam to the doctor, reassuring Robert that they were doing everything possible. The doctors attributed Miriam's symptoms to her age and existing health conditions, prescribing medications that did little to alleviate her suffering. The final stage of Sabrina's plan required careful timing. She waited for a day when Robert would be away for an extended period, ensuring she had the house to herself. She prepared a special meal for Miriam, infusing it with a small amount of aconite. The dose was low enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but high enough to exacerbate Miriam's symptoms. As Miriam ate the meal, Sabrina watched her with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. She felt a twisted sense of relief, believing that she was finally taking control of her life. But the act also brought a deep sense of guilt, one that gnawed at her even as she reassured herself that this was the only way. In the days that followed, Miriam's condition worsened. She grew weaker and more lethargic, her complaints of pain more frequent. Robert was beside himself with worry, while Sabrina maintained her facade of concern. The poison was doing its job, slowly but surely, and Sabrina felt both triumphant and terrified at the prospect of what she had set in motion. Sabrina's meticulous planning reached its final stages as she prepared to carry out the poisoning. The growing tension and escalating arguments with Robert only fueled her resolve. She was convinced that eliminating Miriam was the only way to restore harmony to her marriage and reclaim her life. Acquiring the aconite seeds had been a nerve-wracking process. Sabrina knew the risks involved in handling such a potent toxin, but desperation had clouded her judgment. She carefully cultivated the plants, watching them grow with a mix of dread and determination. Each step brought her closer to the point of no return. Sabrina spent hours in her studio, not working on her usual graphic design projects, but refining her plan. She researched the effects of aconite, ensuring she understood the symptoms it would produce. Vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain were common, symptoms that could easily be mistaken for a severe but natural illness in an elderly woman like Miriam. Timing was crucial. Sabrina needed to administer the poison in such a way that it would slowly deteriorate Miriam's health, making her death appear as a natural progression of her existing ailments. She decided to mix small amounts of the aconite into Miriam's food over several weeks, gradually increasing the dosage. Sabrina's first attempt was a simple broth. She chose a day when Robert was working late, giving her the time and privacy she needed. Miriam, unaware of the sinister intent behind the meal, ate the broth without suspicion. Sabrina watched her carefully, noting any signs of discomfort. In the days that followed, Miriam began to complain more frequently of stomach pains and nausea. Sabrina played the concerned daughter-in-law, offering comfort and suggesting they visit the doctor. Robert, seeing Sabrina's apparent dedication, was grateful and less inclined to suspect any foul play. Sabrina continued to administer the poison, each dose carefully calculated to avoid immediate detection. She alternated the methods of delivery, sometimes mixing it into tea, other times blending it into soups or casseroles. Each meal brought Miriam closer to the brink, her health steadily declining. Despite her outward calm, Sabrina was racked with guilt and fear. The enormity of her actions weighed heavily on her, but she convinced herself that this was the only solution. She reminded herself of the life she would regain once Miriam was gone, a life free from the constant strain and arguments. Robert's increasing concern for his mother's health provided Sabrina with the perfect cover. He arranged for multiple doctor visits, each one yielding no definitive answers. The medical professionals attributed Miriam's symptoms to her age and existing conditions, prescribing medications that did little to help. Sabrina's plan seemed to be working flawlessly. Miriam's decline was gradual, and the doctors saw no reason to suspect foul play. Sabrina's meticulous research and careful administration of the poison ensured that Miriam's symptoms matched those of a natural illness. The final dose was administered on a particularly stressful day. Robert had left for an extended business trip, leaving Sabrina and Miriam alone in the house. It was the perfect opportunity to deliver the fatal dose of aconite without immediate suspicion. The house felt unnaturally quiet, a silence that seemed to echo Sabrina's racing thoughts. Sabrina prepared Miriam's favorite soup, a creamy mushroom bisque. She measured the aconite carefully, her hand steady despite the turmoil inside her. This was it. There was no turning back. The poison, now finely ground and nearly invisible, was mixed into the soup with methodical precision. As she carried the bowl to the dining table, Sabrina forced a smile. "Lunch is ready, Miriam. I made your favorite." Miriam, looking frailer than ever, managed a weak smile. "Thank you, dear. You're so kind." Sabrina felt a pang of guilt but quickly suppressed it. She watched as Miriam slowly ate the soup, each spoonful bringing her closer to the end. The meal progressed in a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Miriam's labored breathing. As the poison took effect, Miriam's discomfort became evident. She clutched her stomach, her face contorted in pain. Sabrina maintained her facade of concern, suggesting they call a doctor. But the symptoms progressed rapidly, and soon Miriam was struggling to breathe. Sabrina dialed 911, her voice filled with feigned panic. "My mother-in-law is very ill. Please send an ambulance quickly." The paramedics arrived within minutes, finding Miriam in severe distress. They rushed her to the hospital, with Sabrina following closely behind. In the sterile confines of the emergency room, Sabrina watched as the doctors and nurses worked frantically to save Miriam. She maintained her act, shedding tears and expressing worry, but inside she felt a grim sense of relief. Despite their efforts, Miriam's condition deteriorated rapidly. The poison had done its job, and within hours Miriam passed away. The official cause of death was listed as complications from her existing health issues, exacerbated by her age. The doctors saw no reason to suspect foul play, and Sabrina's plan seemed to have succeeded perfectly. Robert was devastated when he received the news. He returned home immediately, shattered by the loss of his mother. Sabrina played the supportive wife, comforting him through his grief while hiding the dark truth. The funeral was a somber affair, with friends and family gathering to pay their respects. Sabrina's performance was flawless, her sorrow appearing genuine to all who observed, but the guilt gnawed at her. Each time Robert spoke of his mother's kindness and strength, Sabrina felt a stab of remorse. She had taken an innocent life, driven by desperation and resentment. The relief she had expected was overshadowed by the weight of her actions. She had crossed a line and there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Robert threw himself into his work, using it as a distraction from his grief. Sabrina, meanwhile, tried to resume her usual routines, but the shadow of her crime loomed large. She found it difficult to concentrate on her graphic design projects, her mind constantly replaying the events of that fateful day. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor, but Sabrina attributed it to the stress of Miriam's death and the strain on her marriage. She continued to put on a brave face, maintaining the facade of a grieving daughter-in-law, but inside she was falling apart. One night, as she lay in bed beside Robert, the enormity of her actions hit her with full force. She had committed murder, taken a life to solve her problems, and now she had to live with the consequences. The thought was overwhelming, and Sabrina found herself trembling with a mix of fear and regret. Robert, sensing her distress, reached out to comfort her. But deep down, she knew that the truth could not remain hidden forever. The seeds of her crime were planted, and it was only a matter of time before they bore fruit. Sabrina's carefully constructed world was built on a foundation of lies, and as the days passed, she began to realize that the price of her actions would be far greater than she had ever imagined. In the aftermath of Miriam's death, life in the Brooks household settled into a somber routine. Robert's grief was palpable, and Sabrina did her best to support him, all the while masking her own turmoil. She believed she had successfully concealed her crime, but the peace she longed for remained elusive. Little did she know, the real consequences of her actions were about to unfold. The initial investigation into Miriam's death was routine. The doctors attributed her passing to natural causes, given her age and existing health conditions. However, a nurse who had been present during Miriam's final hours noticed something odd. The rapid progression of her symptoms seemed unusual, even for someone of her age. The nurse, Emma Collins, mentioned her concerns to the attending physician, Dr. Alan Harris. Emma was experienced and meticulous, not one to jump to conclusions. Dr. Harris, although initially dismissive, agreed to review Miriam's case notes. Upon closer inspection, he too found the rapid deterioration puzzling. They decided to conduct a more thorough autopsy, just to be sure. The autopsy revealed traces of a toxin in Miriam's system, something that should not have been there. Dr. Harris immediately alerted the authorities, and the case was escalated to the Greenwood Police Department. Detective Laura Rogan was assigned to lead the investigation. Detective Rogan was a seasoned investigator with a keen eye for detail. She began by interviewing the medical staff who had attended to Miriam, gathering information about her symptoms and the timeline of her decline. The discovery of the toxin raised alarm bells, and Rogan knew this was no ordinary case. Next, Rogan turned her attention to the Brooks household. She interviewed Robert first, who was devastated by the news of a potential foul play. His genuine shock and grief were evident, and Rogan quickly ruled him out as a suspect. Sabrina, however, presented a more complex picture. Sabrina was composed during the interview, expressing appropriate levels of sadness and concern. But Rogan sensed something was off. There was a guardedness in Sabrina's demeanor, a subtle tension that didn't sit right. Rogan had seen it before, the signs of someone hiding something. Sabrina, when questioned about Miriam's health, reiterated the doctor's findings. She played the role of the caring daughter-in-law, describing how she had tried to make Miriam comfortable and had taken her to the doctor multiple times. But her story seemed rehearsed, and Rogan made a mental note to dig deeper. The detectives decided to search the Brooks house, focusing on areas where they might find evidence of poison. Sabrina grew increasingly anxious as they combed through the kitchen, the garden, and her studio. She tried to maintain her composure, but the stress was evident in her trembling hands and forced calm. In the garden, the detectives found a small patch of monkshood plants, the source of aconite. Rogan's suspicions grew. She sent samples to the lab for analysis, and the results confirmed the presence of aconite, the same toxin found in Miriam's system. The breakthrough came when the detectives discovered Sabrina's internet search history. Her computer revealed extensive research on poisons, specifically aconite, and methods of administering it. The evidence was damning, painting a clear picture of premeditated murder. Rogan confronted Sabrina with the findings. In the face of irrefutable evidence, Sabrina broke down. The facade crumbled, and she confessed to the crime, her voice filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. She explained how the strain of living with Miriam had driven her to commit the unthinkable, believing it was the only way to save her marriage. The confession shocked Robert to his core. The woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, had murdered his mother. His world shattered, and he struggled to comprehend the depth of Sabrina's betrayal. The couple's friends and family were equally stunned. unable to reconcile the image of the charming, creative Sabrina with that of a cold-blooded killer. Sabrina's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The trial was set to begin 3 months after Sabrina's arrest. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Reed, presented a compelling case built on the extensive evidence gathered by Detective Rogan and her team. The jury deliberated for several days, weighing the evidence and testimonies presented. The community held its breath, waiting for the verdict. When the jury finally returned, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. The foreman stood and read the verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Sabrina was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The sentence reflected the severity of her crime, while also acknowledging the mitigating circumstances presented by the defense. For Robert, the verdict brought a bittersweet sense of closure. Justice had been served, but the scars left by Sabrina's actions would never fully heal. The trial's conclusion marked the end of a tragic chapter for the Brooks family. Robert, now faced with the task of rebuilding his life, decided to leave Greenwood. The town, once a place of happy memories, had become a constant reminder of his loss. He moved to a different city, seeking a fresh start and hoping to find some semblance of peace. In the end, the Brooks family saga served as a stark reminder of the destructive power of desperation and the importance of compassion, understanding, and mental health support. It was a story that underscored the fragile nature of human relationships and the devastating consequences that could arise when those bonds were pushed to their breaking point. Randall Mamet, a successful businessman, his wife Sydney, a dedicated homemaker, and Sydney's daughter from a previous marriage, Celeste, lived in a sprawling house. Their neighbors saw them as the perfect family, affluent, attractive, and seemingly happy. But beneath the polished exterior of manicured lawns and dinner parties, a sinister undercurrent was about to pull the Mamets into a vortex of forbidden desire, betrayal, and ultimately, violence. What began as a typical case of marital discontent would spiral into a shocking tale of taboo romance between stepfather and stepdaughter, culminating in a confrontation that ended in twisted death and others' lives shattered beyond repair. Randall and Sydney Mamet's romance began like many others, with a chance encounter at a charity gala in Philadelphia in the spring of 2010. Randall, then 35, was a rising star in the world of finance, known for his sharp mind and charismatic personality. Sydney, 32 at the time, was a divorcee with a young daughter, working as an interior designer for wealthy clients. Their whirlwind courtship captivated their social circle. Randall was smitten by Sydney's elegance and wit, while Sydney saw in Randall the stability and success she craved after her tumultuous first marriage. Within 6 months, Randall had proposed, presenting Sydney with a dazzling diamond ring that became the envy of their friends. The wedding, held at the prestigious Rittenhouse Hotel, was the social event of the season. Sydney's 7-year-old daughter, Celeste, served as the flower girl, her cherubic face beaming as she watched her mother marry the man who would become her stepfather. For the first few years, the Mamets seemed to thrive. Randall's career continued to soar, and he was soon made partner at his firm. Sydney threw herself into the role of the perfect corporate wife, hosting dinner parties and charity events that cemented their status in elite circles. She doted on Celeste, ensuring the girl wanted for nothing, from the best schools to extravagant vacations. But as the novelty of their new life together wore off, cracks began to appear in the foundation of their marriage. Randall's long hours at the office and frequent business trips left Sydney feeling neglected. She had given up her career to support his, and now found herself increasingly isolated in their large, empty house. Sydney's attempts to rekindle the romance were met with indifference from Randall, who seemed more interested in his spreadsheets than his wife. Their conversations, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, became terse exchanges about household matters and Celeste's school schedule. By the time Celeste entered high school, the Mamets' marriage existed mostly for show. They slept in separate bedrooms, citing Randall snoring as the reason to curious friends. Their interactions were cordial but cold, like business partners rather than loving spouses. Sydney threw herself into volunteer work and her role as Celeste's mother, living vicariously through her daughter's achievements and social life. Randall buried himself deeper in his work, taking on more responsibilities at the firm and spending even less time at home. Neither was willing to admit defeat and file for divorce. Their shared fear of scandal, the comfort of their lifestyle, and concern for how it would affect Celeste kept them trapped in their loveless union. Little did they know that their carefully maintained facade was about to crumble in the most unexpected and tragic way. As Celeste blossomed from a precocious child into a striking young woman, the dynamics in the Mamet household began to shift. Now 18 and preparing for college, Celeste had inherited her mother's grace and her biological father's vivacious spirit. Celeste's relationship with her mother had always been close, if sometimes strained by Sydney's tendency to overprotect and live through her daughter's experiences. With Randall, however, things had been more complicated. In the early years of the marriage, he had been a doting stepfather, attending her recitals and helping with homework. But as his marriage to Sydney cooled, so did his interactions with Celeste. That changed during Celeste's senior year of high school. Randall, perhaps feeling the weight of his own mortality as he approached 50, began to take a renewed interest in his stepdaughter's life. He attended her dance performances, beaming with pride from the audience. He engaged her in conversations about her college plans, offering advice on majors and career paths. Sydney, at first, was pleased to see Randall finally acting like part of the family again. She encouraged the father-daughter bonding, hoping it might somehow bridge the gulf in their marriage. But as the months wore on, she began to sense something unsettling in the way Randall looked at Celeste, in the way their conversations would stop abruptly when she entered a room. Celeste, for her part, found herself drawn to Randall in a way that both excited and confused her. His attention made her feel seen in a way she hadn't before. She began to dress more carefully when she knew he'd be home, to seek out his company under the guise of needing help with college applications or financial advice. The tension in the house grew palpable. Family dinners became a minefield of loaded glances and double entendres. Sydney watched with growing unease as her daughter and husband orbited each other, their gravitational pull seeming to exclude her entirely. As Celeste's high school graduation approached, the Mamet house was a powder keg of unspoken desires and simmering resentments. None of them could have predicted the explosion that was to come, or the devastating aftermath that would follow. The line between appropriate stepfather-stepdaughter affection and something more sinister was crossed on a rainy night in April, just weeks before Celeste's graduation. Sydney was out of town for a charity event, leaving Randall and Celeste alone in the house. They had settled in to watch a movie, a bottle of wine between them. Randall reasoning that at 18 Celeste was old enough for a glass or two under parental supervision. As the wine flowed and the storm raged outside, their inhibitions lowered. Celeste, emboldened by alcohol and the charged atmosphere, confessed to Randall that she had always found him attractive. Randall, his judgment clouded and his loneliness overwhelming, responded not with the fatherly dismissal he should have, but with a confession of his own growing feelings. One touch led to another, and soon they found themselves entangled on the couch, years of suppressed attraction exploding into a passionate encounter. The next morning brought with it shame, confusion, and the thrill of forbidden fruit tasted. Both Randall and Celeste swore it would never happen again, that it was a mistake born of loneliness and wine. But the dam had broken, and the flood of desire was not so easily contained. Stolen glances became stolen kisses, furtive touches beneath the dinner table, coded text messages arranging clandestine meetings. They justified their actions to themselves and each other. Randall wasn't Celeste's real father, they reasoned. Sydney had been cold and distant for years. They were both consenting adults. Love, they told each other, couldn't be wrong. But the guilt gnawed at them, particularly Celeste. She saw the pain in her mother's eyes, the growing suspicion. She knew the devastating impact this would have if discovered, yet she couldn't bring herself to end it, addicted to the rush of their forbidden romance. Randall compartmentalized, as he did with all aspects of his life. When with Sydney, he played the role of distant but dutiful husband. With his colleagues, he was the consummate professional. But in those secret moments with Celeste, he allowed himself to feel a passion he thought he had lost forever. Their trysts became more frequent and daring as the weeks passed. A rendezvous at a motel on the outskirts of town, under the guise of college tours. Heated encounters in Randall's car, parked in secluded spots. Each time they swore it would be the last. Each time they found themselves drawn back together, powerless against the pull of their illicit desire. But as spring turned to summer, the web of lies they had woven began to tangle, threatening to ensnare them all. As Celeste's freshman year of college approached, the affair between her and Randall intensified. The impending separation seemed to fuel their passion, each encounter tinged with a desperate urgency. They began taking greater risks, their need for each other overriding their caution. Randall started finding excuses to visit Celeste at her college campus, a mere 2-hour drive away. He would claim business meetings in the area, when in reality he was spending long, luxurious afternoons tangled in the sheets of Celeste's dorm room. Celeste, for her part, would invent study groups and extracurricular activities to explain her frequent trips home on weekends. Their behavior began to impact their relationships with others. Randall grew even more distant from Sydney, barely able to look at her without feeling a stab of guilt. He threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, using it as both an escape and an excuse for his absences. Celeste struggled to connect with her college peers, always holding back, always guarding her explosive secret. The affair also began to change them as individuals. Randall, reinvigorated by his relationship with Celeste, started paying more attention to his appearance. He joined a gym, updated his wardrobe, even contemplated hair restoration treatments. His colleagues remarked on his newfound energy, assuming he had finally found work-life balance. Celeste, meanwhile, found herself torn between exhilaration and shame. She excelled in her studies, channeling her turbulent emotions into her coursework, but her social life suffered. She rebuffed advances from classmates, unable to contemplate a normal relationship while entangled with her stepfather. There were close calls that should have served as wake-up calls. Once, Sydney nearly walked in on them in a compromising position in the pool house, saved only by a well-timed phone call that delayed her arrival home. Another time, one of Celeste's dorm mates spotted Randall leaving her room early in the morning, leading to awkward questions that Celeste clumsily deflected. Despite these near misses, Randall and Celeste convinced themselves they could maintain their secret indefinitely. They began making tentative plans for a future together, whispering about the day when they could finally be open about their love. Randall spoke of divorcing Sydney, of starting a new life with Celeste once she finished college. Celeste daydreamed about a fairy tale wedding, conveniently ignoring the devastation it would wreak on her mother. But as their fantasy future grew more elaborate, so did the tangled web of lies required to sustain their present. Randall's finances came under scrutiny at home as Sydney questioned the increased business expenses and mysterious cash withdrawals. Celeste's academic performance, while still strong, began to slip as the stress of her double life took its toll. The pressure began to mount, the cracks in their carefully constructed facade widening day by day. Still they persisted, each stolen moment together reinforcing their belief that their love was worth any cost. They failed to see that the price would be far higher than either of them could have imagined, and that the bill was coming due far sooner than they knew. It was during a lunch with her friend Beatrice that the first inkling of the terrible truth began to form in Sydney's mind. Beatrice, ever the gossip, mentioned offhandedly that she'd seen Randall and Celeste having an intense conversation at a cafe in town, at a time when Celeste was supposed to be at college and Randall at work. The way Beatrice described their body language, leaning in close, hands touching on the table, sent a chill down Sydney's spine. She brushed it off, laughing too loudly and changing the subject, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. From that moment on, Sydney began to pay closer attention to the interactions between her husband and daughter. She noticed the lingering glances, the inside jokes she wasn't privy to, the way they always seemed to find reasons to be alone together. As the evidence mounted, Sydney found herself trapped in a state of denial. The alternative was too horrible to contemplate, but with each passing day, the truth she didn't want to face inched closer to the surface, threatening to explode into the open and shatter their lives forever. The day Sydney's world imploded started like any other. It was a warm June morning, the air heavy with the promise of summer storms. Sydney had plans to meet friends for lunch, but a last-minute cancellation left her with an unexpected free afternoon. On a whim, she decided to surprise Randall at his office, perhaps suggest an impromptu date night to rekindle their faltering connection. But Randall wasn't in his office. His assistant, flustered by Sydney's unexpected appearance, let slip that Mr. Mamet had left early, mentioning something about a family emergency. Sydney felt her blood run cold. There was no family emergency she knew of. With trembling hands, She took out her phone and opened the tracking app she'd installed weeks ago in a moment of paranoid weakness. The pulsing dot of Randall's location appeared not at home, not at any hospital, but at a nondescript address on the outskirts of town. The drive to that address was a blur. Sydney moved on autopilot, her mind racing through possibilities, each more devastating than the last. She pulled up to a small motel, the kind that rented rooms by the hour, and there in the parking lot was Randall's car. Sydney sat in her vehicle, paralyzed with indecision. Did she really want to know? Couldn't she just drive away, pretend she'd never seen this? But then another car pulled into the lot, Celeste's beat-up college Honda. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Sydney watched her daughter hurry across the parking lot and knock on one of the motel room doors. It opened, Randall's familiar silhouette visible for a moment before Celeste slipped inside. Sydney sat in stunned silence, her mind refusing to process what her eyes had just witnessed. Seconds stretched into minutes as she stared at the closed motel room door, willing it to be some sort of mistake, a misunderstanding, anything but the betrayal it so clearly was. Finally, operating on instinct rather than conscious thought, Sydney got out of her car. She raised her hand to knock, then paused, her fist trembling in midair. From inside, she could hear muffled laughter, Celeste's musical giggle, Randall's deeper chuckle. The sounds of happiness and intimacy twisted like a knife in her gut. With a deep breath, Sydney steeled herself and rapped sharply on the door. The laughter inside abruptly ceased, replaced by hushed, panicked whispers. She knocked again, louder this time, her calm facade cracking as she called out. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before she heard movement inside. The door opened slowly, revealing Randall, his hair mussed and shirt hastily buttoned. Behind him, Sydney could see Celeste, her face a mask of guilt and fear. In that moment, as Sydney looked from her husband to her daughter, the full weight of their betrayal came crashing down upon her. Her world, already fragile, shattered completely. The tension in the small motel room was suffocating as Sydney stepped inside, her eyes darting between Randall and Celeste. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the ancient air conditioner and the pounding of Sydney's heart in her ears. Randall was the first to break the silence, his voice strained as he attempted to explain. But Sydney cut him off, her voice eerily calm. Randall stepped forward, attempting to shield Celeste. "Sydney, please. This isn't Celeste's fault." A harsh laugh escaped Sydney's lips. The argument escalated quickly, years of pent-up resentment and betrayal pouring out. Accusations flew back and forth. Sydney accused Randall of grooming Celeste, of taking advantage of her youth and innocence. Randall defended their relationship, insisting it was real love, that Celeste is an adult now. Celeste, caught between her mother and the man she thought she loved, tried desperately to mediate. She pleaded with Sydney to understand, swore that Randall had never taken advantage of her, that their feelings were mutual. But Sydney was beyond reason. In her eyes, this was the ultimate betrayal, not just of her as a wife, but as a mother. As the shouting reached a fever pitch, Sydney noticed Randall inching towards the bedside table. She saw the glint of metal and realized with a jolt of fear that he was reaching for something. The gun he always kept for protection. Time seemed to slow down. Sydney lunged for Randall, determined to stop him from doing something unthinkable. Celeste, seeing her mother's sudden movement, misinterpreted it as an attack on Randall and tried to intervene. In the ensuing scuffle, the gun went off. The sound of the shot was deafening in the small room. For a moment, everything went still. Then Celeste crumpled to the floor, a red stain blossoming on her shirt. Sydney's scream of anguish shattered the silence. Randall stood frozen, the gun slipping from his nerveless fingers. As Sydney frantically tried to stem the blood flowing from her daughter's wound, the full horror of what had happened began to sink in. Their secret was out, and the consequences were far more devastating than any of them could have imagined. The gunshot at the motel brought a swift response from local law enforcement. Within minutes, the small parking lot was awash in flashing lights as police cars and an ambulance converged on the scene. First responders found a tableau of tragedy in room 114. Celeste lay on the floor, barely clinging to life despite Sydney's desperate attempts to stop the bleeding. Randall Mamet sat slumped in a corner, his eyes vacant, the gun still on the floor where he had dropped it. Sydney, her hands and clothes covered in her daughter's blood, alternated between frantic pleas to the paramedics and incoherent sobs. Detective Liam Donovan, a veteran of the small police force, took charge of the scene. As Celeste was rushed to the hospital, Donovan began the grim task of piecing together what had happened in that motel room. The physical evidence was clear enough. One shot fired, one victim. The gun registered to Randall Mamet. But the why of it all was murkier. Initial questioning of Sydney and Randall yielded conflicting stories, both too distraught to provide a coherent account of events. As news of the shooting spread, the quiet community was rocked by shock and disbelief. The Mamets had always seemed like the perfect family. Successful, respected, involved in local charities. The idea that such violence could erupt among them was almost inconceivable to their neighbors and friends. In the days that followed, as Celeste fought for her life in the ICU, Detective Donovan and his team worked tirelessly to unravel the truth. They combed through phone records, interviewed friends and colleagues, and dug into the family's background. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of a family not nearly as perfect as their polished exterior suggested. As Detective Donovan delved deeper into the Mamet case, the facade of the perfect family crumbled rapidly. Interviews with family friends and colleagues painted a picture of a marriage long devoid of love, held together by appearances and financial convenience. Beatrice Whitaker, Sydney's closest friend, provided crucial information about Sydney's growing suspicions in the months leading up to the shooting. She recounted tearful lunches where Sydney had confided her fears about Randall's possible infidelity, never suspecting the true nature of his betrayal. Randall's co-workers described a man who had seemed rejuvenated in recent months, speaking often of a new love in his life. They had assumed he was having a typical midlife crisis affair, never imagining the object of his affection was his own stepdaughter. But it was Celeste's college roommate who provided the most damning evidence. Once assured of police confidentiality, Zoe shared a trove of text messages Celeste had sent her, detailing the affair with Randall in the sort of giddy, love-struck language typical of a young woman in the throes of what she believed to be true love. The digital trail proved to be a goldmine for investigators. Subpoenaed phone records showed hundreds of calls and messages between Randall and Celeste, often at odd hours. Financial records showed a pattern of expensive gifts from Randall to Celeste, jewelry, designer clothes, even a car, all carefully hidden from Sydney. There were records of hotel stays, weekend getaways disguised as business trips or college visits. As the evidence mounted, the full extent of Randall and Celeste's deception became clear. This was no sudden passion, no momentary lapse in judgment. Their affair had been going on for over a year, meticulously planned and hidden from Sydney and the world. The revelation of the affair shed new light on the events in the motel room. What had first appeared to be a case of accidental discharge during a heated argument now looked more like a potential crime of passion. As Celeste slowly recovered in the hospital, the question on everyone's mind was, who had really pulled the trigger? Was it Randall attempting to silence Celeste to save himself? Sydney in a fit of rage at their betrayal? Or Celeste herself, overcome with guilt and shame when confronted by her mother? The truth, Detective Donovan suspected, might be more complex than any of them had initially thought. District Attorney took personal charge of the case. After reviewing the evidence gathered by Detective Donovan and his team, she made the decision to charge both Randall and Sydney Mamet with attempted murder. Randall, once the picture of corporate success, appeared haggard and defeated in his orange jumpsuit. His defense team, led by high-powered attorney Xavier Brockton, argued that the shooting had been a tragic accident, the result of a struggle for the gun during a heated family argument. Sydney, by contrast, seemed to have aged years in the weeks since the incident. Her lawyer painted her as a victim, a woman betrayed by her husband and daughter, who had acted in self-defense when she believed Randall was reaching for the gun to silence them both. The question of Celeste's role in the incident loomed large over the proceedings. As the only witness to the shooting besides her parents, her testimony would be crucial. But Celeste, still recovering from her injuries, had so far invoked her Fifth Amendment rights, refusing to testify against either parent. In the end, Randall Mamet accepted the plea deal. In a hushed courtroom, he pleaded guilty to aggravated assault, receiving a sentence of 10 years in prison. As he was led away in handcuffs, he locked eyes with Sydney one last time, a look that spoke volumes about the pain, betrayal, and regret that had torn their family apart. Sydney, charges against her dropped, left the courthouse a free woman, but one irrevocably changed by the ordeal. Within months, she had sold the family home and moved out of state, seeking a fresh start away from the whispers and sidelong glances. Celeste, once she recovered from her physical wounds, faced the daunting task of healing her emotional and psychological scars. She withdrew from college, entering intensive therapy to deal with the trauma of the shooting and the complicated emotions surrounding her relationship with Randall. Her relationship with Sydney remained strained, the breach of trust between mother and daughter, a chasm not easily bridged. The Mamet case faded from the national spotlight, but its impact lingered. It served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most picture-perfect families can harbor dark secrets. The community, shaken by the violence that had erupted in their midst, began initiatives to address domestic violence and promote healthier family dynamics. At the heart of this tale are three individuals whose paths would become inextricably intertwined. Alton Rhodes, the 19-year-old young man whose charm would prove both irresistible and destructive. Mandy Carell, a neglected wife yearning for passion. M. Delilah Frost, a recent divorcee seeking to reclaim her sense of self. Their story would ultimately lead to a shocking act of violence that would forever change the face of the community, leaving its residents to question how well they truly knew their neighbors. At just 19, Alton Rhodes exuded a confidence and maturity that belied his years. Standing at 6 feet tall, he turned heads wherever he went. But it wasn't just his looks that drew people in. Alton possessed a magnetic personality that made everyone feel special in his presence. Raised by a single mother who worked long hours as a nurse, Alton had learned early on to fend for himself. He'd developed a knack for reading people, understanding their needs and desires sometimes before they did themselves. This skill served him well in his part-time job as a barista at the local coffee shop, where he quickly became a favorite among the regulars. Alton had moved to Redwood just a month after graduating high school, eager to strike out on his own. His mother had reconnected with an old friend in the area who offered Alton the place to stay while he figured out his next steps. He had vague plans of attending community college, but for now he was content to work and enjoy his newfound freedom. The young man's arrival in the neighborhood didn't go unnoticed. Women of all ages found excuses to visit the coffee shop during his shifts, while men grudgingly admired his easy charm. Alton took it all in stride, flashing his dimpled smile and engaging in friendly banter with everyone who crossed his path. But it was his encounters with his immediate neighbors that would set in motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. On one side of his temporary home lived the Carells, an outwardly perfect couple whose carefully maintained image hid a crumbling marriage. On the other side resided Delilah Frost, a woman in her early 40s struggling to rebuild her life after a bitter divorce. Alton's first meeting with Mandy Carell occurred on a sunny Saturday morning as he was mowing the lawn. She had come over to welcome him to the neighborhood, bearing a plate of homemade cookies. Their eyes met, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. Little did either of them know that this innocent encounter would be the first step down a dangerous path. Mandy Carell appeared to have it all: a successful husband, a beautiful home, and the envy of her peers. But behind closed doors, her life was far from perfect. Married for 15 years to Gregory, a prominent surgeon, Mandy had slowly watched the passion and intimacy drain from their relationship. Mandy had once been vivacious and ambitious, with dreams of becoming a renowned artist. However, as Gregory's career flourished, she found herself relegated to the role of trophy wife, expected to maintain their home and social status while her own aspirations withered. Her paintings, once filled with vibrant colors and raw emotion, now gathered dust in a forgotten corner of their basement. The first time Mandy laid eyes on Alton, she felt a spark she thought had long since died. His youthful energy and genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings awakened something within her. She found herself making excuses to be outside when he was around, carefully selecting her outfits and rediscovering her makeup collection. Their interaction started innocently enough. Mandy would bring over baked goods or offer gardening advice, lingering longer each time to chat. Alton, in turn, seemed genuinely interested in her life and experiences. He asked about her artwork, and his enthusiasm rekindled her passion for painting. One evening, as Gregory was working late yet again, Mandy invited Alton over to see her old paintings. As they stood in the dim light of the basement, surrounded by canvases that told the story of her faded dreams, something shifted between them. Alton's hand brushed against hers, and Mandy felt a jolt of electricity course through her body. She turned to face him, her heart pounding. Alton's eyes searched hers, asking a silent question. In that moment, all the years of neglect and loneliness culminated in a desperate need for connection. Mandy leaned in, and their lips met in a kiss that would change everything. As she pulled away, breathless and conflicted, Mandy knew she was standing on the precipice of a decision that could unravel her entire life. But the fire that Alton had ignited within her was too strong to ignore. For the first time in years, she felt alive, desired and seen. At 42 years old, Delilah Frost was starting over. After 20 years of marriage, she had finally found the courage to leave her emotionally abusive husband. The divorce had been finalized just 3 months before Alton moved in next door, leaving Delilah raw and vulnerable. Once a confident and outgoing woman, years of criticism and manipulation had eroded Delilah's self-esteem. She second-guessed every decision. From her choice of clothing to her career moves, the divorce had drained her financially and emotionally, forcing her to downsize from the lavish home she once shared with her ex-husband to the modest house in Redwood. Delilah's first encounter with Alton came on a rainy afternoon when she was struggling to carry groceries from her car. Without hesitation, he rushed over to help, flashing a warm smile that made her feel seen for the first time in years. As they chatted while putting away her groceries, Delilah found herself opening up about her recent divorce and the challenges of rebuilding her life. To her surprise, Alton listened without judgment, offering words of encouragement and support. His youthful optimism was infectious, and Delilah found herself smiling more than she had in months. Before he left, Alton suggested they have coffee sometime, an invitation that both thrilled and terrified her. In the days that followed, Delilah found herself looking forward to their casual encounters. She began taking evening walks, timing them to coincide with Alton's return from work. They would often stop to chat, and Delilah relished the way Alton made her feel, not as a broken middle-aged divorcee but as a woman with value and appeal. Their friendship deepened quickly. Alton showed genuine interest in Delilah's work as a freelance graphic designer, even offering to help her build a website to attract more clients. His belief in her abilities reignited her passion for her career, and she found herself taking on new projects with renewed confidence. One night, as they sat on Delilah's porch sharing a bottle of wine, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. Alton's hand brushed against hers, and Delilah felt a rush of desire she thought she'd never experience again. When he leaned in to kiss her, she didn't hesitate. In that moment, all her doubts and insecurities melted away, replaced by a burning need to feel alive and wanted once more. As summer gave way to fall, Alton found himself entangled in 2 passionate affairs, each filling a different void in his life. With Mandy, he experienced a depth of emotion and intellectual connection he had never known before. Their clandestine meetings were filled with intense discussions about art, life, and dreams, interspersed with moments of fiery passion. Mandy's neglected talents flourished under Alton's admiration, and she began painting again with renewed vigor. Delilah, on the other hand, offered Alton a sense of nurturing and stability he had always craved. Their time together was marked by comfort and easy laughter, with Delilah's confidence growing stronger with each encounter. Alton found himself playing the role of supportive partner, encouraging her career ambitions and helping her rediscover her self-worth. The young man rationalized his behavior, convincing himself that he was helping both women find happiness and fulfillment. He skillfully juggled his time between them, using his job at the coffee shop and fictitious study groups as covers for his rendezvous. Mandy reveled in the secret thrill of her affair, feeling more alive than she had in years. She threw herself into her art, producing a series of abstract paintings that pulsed with newfound passion and energy. Her renewed zest for life didn't go unnoticed by her husband, Gregory, who attributed the change to a new fitness routine Mandy had ostensibly started. Meanwhile, Delilah blossomed under Alton's attention. Her wardrobe underwent a transformation, reflecting her growing confidence. Friends remarked on the positive change in her demeanor, assuming she had finally moved on from her painful divorce. As weeks turned into months, both women grew increasingly attached to Alton. Mandy began to fantasize about leaving her loveless marriage, imagining a future where she could pursue her art freely with Alton by her side. Delilah, having experienced the pain of a failed marriage, was more cautious but couldn't help dreaming of a fresh start with someone who truly appreciated her. Alton, for his part, became more deeply enmeshed in the web of deceit he had woven. He cared for both women and found himself unable to choose between them. The excitement of his double life began to wear thin, replaced by a constant state of anxiety and guilt. One crisp autumn evening, as Alton lay in Mandy's arms in the secret studio she had set up in her basement, she whispered words that sent a chill down his spine. "I think I'm falling in love with you." Later that same night, in Delilah's warm kitchen, she gazed at him over a cup of tea and confessed that he made her believe in love again. As Alton walked home in the dark, the weight of his actions finally began to sink in. He realized that what had started as harmless flirtation had grown into something far more complex and potentially destructive. Little did he know, the delicate balance he had been maintaining was about to come crashing down, with consequences more dire than he could have ever imagined. As autumn progressed, Alton's double life became increasingly difficult to maintain. The thrill of secret rendezvous was replaced by a constant state of anxiety and hypervigilance. Every text message, every phone call, every casual encounter in the neighborhood became a potential minefield that could expose his deception. Alton developed an elaborate system of alibis and excuses. He cited increased hours at the coffee shop, fictitious study groups for classes he wasn't taking, and non-existent volunteer work to account for his time. His phone became a source of both connection and dread, carefully managed with separate conversations and meticulously deleted message threads. The pressure began to take its toll on Alton, and his once easy smile became strained. Co-workers at the coffee shop noticed his distraction, attributing it to the stress of balancing work and school. In reality, Alton spent every moment terrified that his carefully constructed house of cards would come tumbling down. There were close calls that left Alton's heart racing. One afternoon, he was walking hand in hand with Delilah in a nearby park when he spotted Mandy in the distance. He quickly steered Delilah in the opposite direction, inventing a sudden craving for ice cream to explain their abrupt change of course. Another time, Alton was helping Mandy carry groceries into her house when Delilah drove by. He ducked behind Mandy's car, pretending to tie his shoe, praying that Delilah hadn't noticed him. The incident left him shaken, realizing how easily his deception could be exposed. As Mandy and Delilah grew more attached, they began to demand more of Alton's time and attention. Mandy, emboldened by her rediscovered passion for art and life, started to talk about leaving her husband. She painted vivid pictures of a future with Alton, filled with love and creative pursuits. These conversations left Alton simultaneously exhilarated and terrified, unsure of how to respond to such earnest declarations, given their age differences. Delilah, while more cautious about jumping into a serious relationship, began to integrate Alton into her life in subtle ways. She introduced him to her friends as her young neighbor, but the affectionate glances and inside jokes they shared spoke volumes. She started making plans for the holidays, hinting at wanting Alton to meet her family. The women's growing expectations added another layer of complexity to Alton's already precarious situation. He found himself making conflicting promises, agreeing to holiday plans with both women, and knowing he would inevitably disappoint one or both of them. As the pressure mounted, Alton's guilt began to manifest physically. He lost weight, his sleep was plagued by nightmares, and he developed a nervous tic, constantly checking his phone and glancing over his shoulder. He knew he needed to end at least one of the affairs, but the thought of hurting either woman was unbearable. What Alton failed to realize was that his increasingly erratic behavior was not going unnoticed. Both Mandy and Delilah, initially blinded by their feelings for him, were beginning to sense that something was amiss. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter the delicate balance Alton had been struggling to maintain. The facade Alton had so carefully constructed came crashing down on a chilly November evening. The annual festival was in full swing, with residents gathering in the town square for food, games, and live music. Alton had agonized over whether to attend, knowing both Mandy and Delilah would be there. In the end, he decided that his absence would be more suspicious than his presence. As Alton navigated through the crowd, he felt like walking on a tightrope. He exchanged pleasant greetings with neighbors, all the while scanning the area for signs of Mandy or Delilah. He had just begun to relax, thinking he might make it through the evening unscathed, when disaster struck. Mandy, who had been volunteering at the face-painting booth, spotted Alton and waved him over enthusiastically. As he reluctantly approached, he saw Delilah at a nearby table, arranging items for the silent auction. Time seemed to slow down as Alton watched the two women, oblivious to each other's significance, moving towards an inevitable collision. Mandy reached Alton first, greeting him with a warm hug that lingered a bit too long for mere neighbors. As she pulled away, her eyes shining with affection, Delilah appeared at Alton's side. The younger man felt the blood drain from his face as the two women sized each other up, confusion slowly giving way to suspicion. An awkward silence fell over the trio, broken only when Mandy, ever the gracious hostess, extended her hand to Delilah and introduced herself. Delilah reciprocated, her eyes darting between Mandy and Alton, noting the familiar way Mandy's hand rested on Alton's arm. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in subtext and veiled accusations. Both women, drawing on their intuition and the subtle signs they had previously dismissed, began to piece together the truth. They spoke of their close friendship with Alton, each anecdote carefully chosen to stake their claim. Alton stood frozen between them, watching helplessly as his carefully compartmentalized worlds collided. He opened his mouth several times to speak, but no words came out. His silence only served to confirm the growing suspicions of both women. The tension reached a breaking point when Mandy, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, mentioned a unique bracelet she had given Alton, a bracelet that was at that very moment visible on his wrist. In that moment, the full extent of Alton's deception became clear to both women. Mandy's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes, while Delilah's expression hardened into one of cold fury. Without another word, both women turned and walked away, leaving Alton standing alone, the weight of his actions finally crashing down upon him. The fallout was immediate and severe. As Mandy and Delilah stormed off in opposite directions, whispers began to circulate through the festival crowd. Neighbors who had witnessed the tense exchange began to speculate, and soon the gossip spread like wildfire through Redwood. Alton, overwhelmed by the sudden exposure of his deceit, fled the festival. He spent the night pacing in his room, alternating between frantically trying to call both women and collapsing in fits of remorse and self-recrimination. The following days were a blur of confrontations and accusations. Mandy showed up at Alton's door the next morning, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. Her quiet devastation was more painful to Alton than any angry outburst could have been. She spoke of betrayal, of shattered trust, and of the love she thought they had shared. When she left, Alton knew that something irreparable had broken between them. Delilah's reaction was markedly different. She refused to answer Alton's calls or texts, instead sending a scathing email that laid bare all of his lies and manipulations. Her words, sharp as knives, cut through any remaining illusions Alton had about the nobility of his actions. She made it clear that he was never to contact her again. As news of the affair spread, Alton found himself ostracized by the community he had so easily charmed just months before. Dirty looks and whispered comments followed him whenever he ventured out. His shifts at the coffee shop became exercises in endurance as he faced the judgment and curiosity of customers who had once adored him. But the worst was yet to come. 1 week after the festival, Alton received a visit from Gregory Carell, Mandy's husband. The normally composed surgeon was trembling with barely contained rage as he confronted Alton about the affair. It was clear that the exposure of Mandy's infidelity had shattered the Carells' already fragile marriage. As the dust began to settle, Alton was left to face the consequences of his actions. He had not only broken the hearts of 2 women, but had also disrupted the lives of everyone around them. The once peaceful neighborhood of Redwood had been irrevocably changed, its residents forced to confront the reality that even in their idyllic suburb, passion and deception could lead to devastating consequences. In the weeks following the revelation at the Harvest Festival, the 2 women, once friendly neighbors, now avoided each other at all costs, their shared humiliation and anger creating an invisible barrier between them. Mandy's life spiraled into chaos. Her husband, Gregory, oscillated between cold fury and desperate attempts to salvage their marriage. Their arguments, once confined to hushed tones behind closed doors, now spilled out into the open. Neighbors pretended not to notice, as shouting matches echoed through the Carells' usually quiet home. Mandy threw herself into her art with a frenetic energy, producing dark, turbulent pieces that reflected her inner turmoil. She spent hours locked in her studio, emerging only to face the wreckage of her personal life. Her once pristine appearance became disheveled, her eyes hollow with grief and lack of sleep. Delilah, on the other hand, retreated into herself. She worked from home, avoiding the pitying glances and whispered comments of her neighbors. Her brief period of renewed confidence shattered. She found herself slipping back into the insecurities that had plagued her after her divorce. Clients noticed a decline in the quality of her work, and several took their business elsewhere. As the initial shock wore off, the women's pain began to transmute into anger, not just at Alton but at each other. They began to see each other as rivals, each blaming the other for the destruction of their relationship with Alton and the upheaval in their lives. The tension between them came to a head one afternoon at the local supermarket. Mandy and Delilah found themselves face to face in the produce section, their shopping carts colliding in a jarring metaphor for their collided lives. What started as terse apologies quickly escalated into a heated exchange of accusations and insults. Delilah, her voice shaking with emotion, accused Mandy of using Alton to escape her loveless marriage. Mandy retaliated by insinuating that Delilah's desperation had made her an easy target for Alton's manipulation. The argument grew louder, drawing the attention of other shoppers, until a store manager was forced to intervene. The incident at the supermarket marked a turning point. What had been a private scandal became a public spectacle, dividing the community of Redwood. People began to take sides, some sympathizing with Mandy's marital struggles, others relating to Delilah's vulnerability as a divorcee. The women found themselves at the center of a maelstrom of gossip and judgment. As the conflict between Mandy and Delilah intensified, Alton became an almost forgotten figure in the drama. He had retreated from public life, rarely leaving his house except to go to work. When he did venture out, he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone he passed. But the young man's attempt to fade into the background would prove futile. Unbeknownst to him, his actions had set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in a tragedy no one could have foreseen. The simmering tensions between Mandy and Delilah were about to boil over, with devastating consequences for everyone involved. The morning of November 15th dawned cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for the tragedy that was about to unfold. Across the street, Delilah Frost was awake, staring at her computer screen as she tried to focus on a project due later that day. Her work, once a source of pride and fulfillment, now felt hollow. She found herself constantly distracted by thoughts of Alton, of Mandy, of the life she had briefly thought might be possible before it all came crashing down. The catalyst for the day's events came in the form of a simple email. Delilah, in a moment of weakness, had decided to reach out to Alton. Her message was brief, a request to meet, to find some closure on their relationship. She hit send before she could second-guess herself, unaware of the chain reaction she had just set in motion. Mandy, who had taken to checking Alton's email, his password unchanged from when they were lovers, saw the message pop up in his inbox. Something inside her snapped. The thought of Alton and Delilah rekindling their relationship, of being left behind while they moved on together, was more than she could bear. In a haze of jealousy and pain, Mandy made her way to Gregory's study. She knew he kept a handgun in his desk drawer, a precaution he'd taken after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood years ago. With shaking hands, she retrieved the weapon, its weight unfamiliar and terrifying in her grasp. Meanwhile, Delilah had decided to clear her head with a walk. The crisp autumn air bit at her cheeks as she made her way down the street, lost in thought. She was so distracted that she didn't notice Mandy approaching until it was too late. Mandy confronted Delilah on the sidewalk, her words a jumble of accusations and grief. Neighbors would later recount hearing raised voices, the sound of an argument escalating rapidly. Delilah, caught off guard by Mandy's sudden appearance and evident distress, tried to calm the situation, her hands raised in a placating gesture. What happened next would be pieced together from eyewitness accounts and forensic evidence. In her heightened emotional state, Mandy produced the gun. Whether she intended to use it or merely to threaten is unclear. Delilah, seeing the weapon, made a move, either to disarm Mandy or to flee. A single shot rang out, shattering the morning quiet of Redwood. Delilah crumpled to the ground, a bloom of red spreading across her chest. Mandy stood frozen, the gun slipping from her nerveless fingers to clatter on the sidewalk. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then chaos erupted. Neighbors, drawn by the sound of the gunshot, rushed from their homes. Someone called 911, while others attempted to render first aid to the fallen Delilah. Mandy remained rooted to the spot, her face a mask of shock and horror, as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. By the time police and paramedics arrived, it was too late. Delilah Frost was pronounced dead at the scene, her life extinguished in a moment of passion and madness. Mandy offered no resistance as she was led away in handcuffs, her blank stare and tear-streaked face a stark contrast to the vibrant, confident woman she had been just months before. As news of the shooting spread, the residents of Redwood were left to grapple with the shocking turn of events. The idyllic facade of their neighborhood had been irreparably shattered, leaving in its wake a community forever changed by tragedy. The police investigation moved swiftly, with multiple witnesses and Mandy Carell's immediate surrender. There was little mystery surrounding the events of that fateful morning. However, as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a complex web of relationships and emotions that had led to the tragic outcome. Gregory Carell, Mandy's husband, found himself thrust into an impossible situation. As a prominent member of the community, he was now faced with the public humiliation of his wife's infidelity, coupled with the horror of her actions. He retreated from public life, taking a leave of absence from the hospital where he worked. The investigation also brought to light the extent of Mandy's emotional distress in the weeks leading up to the shooting. Friends and neighbors, previously hesitant to get involved, now came forward with accounts of her erratic behavior and apparent mental decline. These revelations would later play a crucial role in her legal defense. Talila Frost's family arrived from out of state, shell-shocked and grieving. As the investigation progressed, attention turned to the weapon used in the shooting. The gun, legally registered to Gregory Carell, had been improperly stored, raising questions about his potential liability in the incident. This development added another complex dimension to an already multifaceted case. The trial of Mandy Carell began 6 months after the shooting. The prosecution painted Mandy as a cold-blooded killer, arguing that her actions were premeditated and born of jealousy. They presented evidence of her declining mental state and the calculated retrieval of the weapon as proof of intent. The defense, however, portrayed Mandy as a victim of circumstance, a woman pushed to the brink by betrayal and emotional turmoil. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about the effects of prolonged stress and emotional trauma on decision-making. Alton Rhodes's testimony was a pivotal moment in the trial. His account of the affairs and the events leading up to the shooting provided crucial context, though his appearance on the stand was clearly painful for all involved. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Mandy Carell was found guilty of second-degree murder, a lesser charge than the prosecution had sought. The judge, taking into account the circumstances and Mandy's lack of prior criminal history, sentenced her to 18 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 years. In the years following the trial, the residents of Redwood struggled to move forward. The neighborhood, once known for its tranquility, now carried the weight of tragedy. In the quiet streets of Oak Ridge Heights, a picturesque suburban enclave, the Blackwood residence stood as a beacon of domestic bliss. To the casual observer, Zephyr and Lorelei Blackwood epitomized the American dream: successful careers, a beautifully maintained craftsman home, and a marriage that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. Their neighbors often remarked on the couple's apparent devotion to one another, evidenced by their frequent dinner parties and synchronized jogging routines. But beneath the polished veneer of their seemingly perfect life, the Blackwoods harbored a secret that would ultimately lead to their undoing. For the past 2 years, Zephyr and Lorelei had been active participants in a local swinging community, a lifestyle choice that promised to add excitement and passion to their decade-long marriage. At first, their foray into the world of consensual non-monogamy seemed to reinvigorate their relationship. They spoke of feeling closer, more honest, and more in love than ever before. However, as with many things that glitter, the reality of their chosen path was far more complex and fraught with danger than either could have anticipated. What began as a mutual adventure in sexual exploration would eventually expose deep-seated insecurities and long-buried resentments. This is the story of how a couple's search for excitement and fulfillment led to jealousy, rage, and murder. Zephyr Blackwood was a rising star in the tech scene. With his sharp intellect and innovative ideas, he had quickly climbed the corporate ladder at a leading software company. Colleagues described him as driven, charismatic, and occasionally intense. Standing tall in a runner's physique, Zephyr turned heads wherever he went. Despite his professional success, those closest to him noted a persistent undercurrent of insecurity, stemming from a childhood marked by his parents' messy divorce and his father's subsequent absence. Lorelei Blackwood was Zephyr's perfect complement. A talented freelance graphic designer, she balanced her husband's Type A personality with her more laid-back, creative approach to life. With her warm eyes, infectious laugh, and curves that defied her dedication to yoga, Lorelei was the kind of person who made friends easily and kept them for life. Growing up in a large, boisterous family, she valued connection and openness above all else. The couple met during their senior year at the university. Zephyr was immediately drawn to Lorelei's free spirit and artistic talent, while she found herself captivated by his ambition and hidden vulnerability. Their whirlwind romance culminated in a beachside proposal just 6 months after graduation, and they married a year later in a lavish ceremony that was the talk of their social circle. For the first 7 years of their marriage, Zephyr and Lorelei seemed to have it all. They traveled extensively, built successful careers, and created a home that was the envy of their friends. However, as they approached their mid-30s, a sense of restlessness began to creep into their relationship. The passion that had once burned so brightly had dimmed to a comfortable but uninspiring glow. It was Lorelei who first broached the subject of exploring new avenues in their sex life. Always the more sexually adventurous of the two, she suggested they attend a few workshops on tantric practices and BDSM. Zephyr, eager to please his wife and reignite their spark, agreed enthusiastically. These workshops opened up new channels of communication between the couple, and they found themselves discussing fantasies and desires they had never before shared. It was during one of these conversations that the topic of swinging first arose. Lorelei had read about it online and was intrigued by the idea of consensual non-monogamy. Zephyr, initially hesitant, warmed to the concept as Lorelei painted a picture of increased intimacy and shared adventures. After months of discussion, research, and soul-searching, the Blackwoods decided to take the plunge. They created profiles on swinger websites, attended a few meet-and-greet events, and finally participated in their first full swap with another couple. The experience was exhilarating, and for a time it seemed to breathe new life into their marriage. Little did they know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. The Blackwoods' entry into the world of swinging was marked by a mix of nervous excitement and cautious optimism. Their first experience, a soft swap with a couple they met through a reputable swinger website, exceeded their expectations. The evening was filled with laughter, flirtation, and a level of sexual tension that neither Zephyr nor Lorelei had experienced in years. As they drove home, hands intertwined, they couldn't stop grinning at each other, already planning their next encounter. Over the next few months, Zephyr and Lorelei became regulars in swinging scene. They attended parties at upscale clubs, participated in intimate gatherings at private homes, and even organized a few events of their own. Their social circle expanded rapidly, filled with like-minded couples who shared their desire for excitement and sexual exploration. Lorelei, in particular, thrived in this new environment. Her natural charisma and open-mindedness made her a favorite among their swinging friends. She reveled in the attention she received from both men and women, and her confidence soared. Zephyr, too, seemed to flourish initially. He enjoyed the ego boost that came from other women finding him attractive, and he took pride in having a wife that others desired. The couple's sex life, both with others and between themselves, reached new heights of passion and intensity. They found themselves experimenting with fantasies and kinks they had never before considered. Lorelei would often joke that they were having more sex now than they did in their first year of marriage. As they became more comfortable with the lifestyle, the Blackwoods began to form deeper connections with some of the couples they met. They particularly clicked with Ether and Nova Sterling, a pair of free-spirited artists who had been in the swinging scene for years. The four of them often got together for dinner and drinks, which would invariably lead to steamy encounters that left everyone satisfied. However, as the months wore on, subtle changes began to occur in the dynamics of Zephyr and Lorelei's relationship. While Lorelei continued to embrace the lifestyle with enthusiasm, Zephyr started to show signs of discomfort. He began to notice the way other men looked at his wife, the ease with which she flirted and connected with their swinging partners. What had once been a source of pride now stirred uncomfortable feelings in the pit of his stomach. Zephyr found himself paying closer attention to Lorelei's interactions, especially with Ether Sterling. He couldn't help but notice the lingering touches, the inside jokes, the way Lorelai's eyes seemed to light up in Ether's presence. Rational thought told him that this was all part of the game, that Lorelai always came home with him at the end of the night. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts and fueled his growing insecurity. Despite his misgivings, Zephyr kept his feelings to himself. He didn't want to disappoint Lorelai or appear weak in front of their new friends. Instead, he threw himself into the lifestyle with renewed vigor, as if trying to prove something to himself and others. He initiated more encounters, suggested wilder scenarios, and pushed his boundaries further than he was truly comfortable with. Lorelai, caught up in the excitement and new experiences, failed to notice the subtle changes in her husband's behavior. She interpreted his increased enthusiasm as a sign that he was enjoying the lifestyle as much as she was. In her mind, swinging had brought them closer together, opening up new avenues of communication and shared experiences. As their second anniversary in the lifestyle approached, the Blackwoods were seen as a success story in their swinging circle. They were attractive, fun, and seemingly more in love than ever. But beneath the surface, the seeds of discord had been sown. The very lifestyle that had reinvigorated their marriage was now silently driving a wedge between them, setting the stage for the tragic events that were to come. The first signs of trouble in the Blackwoods' seemingly perfect arrangement appeared subtly at first. Zephyr began to make offhand comments about cutting back on their swinging activities, suggesting they focus more on their own relationship. Lorelai, interpreting this as a passing mood, gently brushed off his concerns and encouraged him to embrace the freedom and excitement they had discovered. As weeks passed, Zephyr's jealousy grew more pronounced. He started to question Lorelai about her interactions with other men, particularly Ether Sterling. His inquiries, initially casual, became more frequent and intense, where once he had enjoyed watching Lorelai with other partners, he now found himself averting his eyes, a knot forming in his stomach. Lorelai, for her part, struggled to understand the change in her husband. She repeatedly assured him of her love and commitment, emphasizing that their adventures in swinging were purely physical and did not threaten their emotional bond. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears as Zephyr's insecurities deepened. The tension between them began to spill over into their daily lives. Arguments that started about swinging quickly devolved into broader accusations and recriminations. Zephyr would bring up past grievances, questioning Lorelai's fidelity even before they entered the lifestyle. Lorelai, frustrated by what she saw as Zephyr's irrational behavior, found herself becoming defensive and withdrawn. Their professional lives started to suffer as well. Zephyr, usually laser-focused at work, became distracted and irritable. His colleagues noticed the change, whispering about possible troubles at home. Lorelai, whose work required creativity and a positive outlook, found it increasingly difficult to meet deadlines and satisfy clients. Despite the growing discord, Lorelai was reluctant to give up the lifestyle that had brought her so much joy and self-discovery. She suggested they take a break from group activities and focus on one-on-one encounters, hoping this would ease Zephyr's jealousy. But even this compromise led to conflict, with Zephyr accusing Lorelai of trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. As their arguments intensified, the Blackwoods' facade of domestic bliss began to crumble. In a last-ditch effort to salvage their marriage, Zephyr suggested they seek counseling. Lorelai agreed, hoping that a professional could help them navigate the complex emotions stirred up by their foray into non-monogamy. However, finding a therapist who was both qualified and non-judgmental about their lifestyle proved challenging, further adding to their frustration. As the date of an upcoming swinger party hosted by the Sterlings approached, the tension in the Blackwood household reached a fever pitch. Lorelai was determined to attend, seeing it as an opportunity to reconnect with friends and reaffirm their place in the community. Zephyr, conflicted and resentful, reluctantly agreed to go, setting the stage for the tragic events that would unfold. The evening of May 15th dawned warm and clear, a perfect spring day. As twilight approached, the Blackwoods began preparing for the Sterlings' party, with an undercurrent of tension thrumming between them. Lorelai hummed to herself as she applied her makeup, choosing a slinky black dress that accentuated her curves. Zephyr, watching her from the doorway, felt a familiar mix of desire and dread coiling in his stomach. They arrived at the Sterlings' upscale loft just as the party was getting started. The spacious apartment was bathed in soft, colorful lights, with sensual music pulsing through hidden speakers. Couples and singles mingled, drinks in hand, the air thick with anticipation and pheromones. Nova Sterling, resplendent in a shimmering gold jumpsuit, greeted them warmly. Zephyr couldn't help but notice how her embrace with Lorelei lingered, the two women exchanging knowing smiles. Ether appeared moments later, clapping Zephyr on the back before placing a gentle kiss on Lorelei's cheek. The knot in Zephyr's stomach tightened. As the night progressed, Zephyr found himself growing increasingly agitated. He watched as Lorelei flitted from group to group, her laughter carrying across the room. She seemed to be in her element, radiating confidence and sensuality. In contrast, Zephyr felt awkward and out of place, nursing the same drink for hours as he observed the interactions around him. The party began to shift gears as couples started to pair off or form small groups, disappearing into the various playrooms the Sterlings had set up. Zephyr lost sight of Lorelei for a while, his anxiety spiking as he searched the crowded loft. He finally spotted her in deep conversation with Ether, their heads close together as they spoke in low tones. Unable to contain himself any longer, Zephyr approached the pair. He caught the tail end of their conversation, something about meeting up later in the week for coffee. Lorelei's eyes widened slightly as she noticed Zephyr, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she composed herself. Zephyr, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, suggested it was time to leave. Lorelei protested, arguing that the night hasn't ended. Their disagreement, though conducted in hushed tones, drew curious glances from nearby guests. Ether, sensing the tension, tried to smooth things over, but his intervention only seemed to irritate Zephyr further. As the argument threatened to escalate, Nova appeared, smoothly inserting herself into the situation. With practiced ease, she guided Zephyr and Lorelei to a quiet corner of the loft, encouraging them to take a moment to cool off. She offered them water and gentle words of advice, reminding them of the community's emphasis on open communication and mutual respect. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Nova's intervention had diffused the situation. Zephyr took a deep breath, visibly trying to calm himself. Lorelei reached out, squeezing his hand in a conciliatory gesture. But as they stood to rejoin the party, Zephyr caught sight of Ether watching them intently. Something in the other man's gaze, concern, pity, or perhaps something else entirely, caused Zephyr's tenuous control to snap. In a cold, clipped voice, he announced that he and Lorelei were leaving. This time, Lorelei didn't argue. She could see the storm brewing behind Zephyr's eyes and knew that staying would only lead to a scene. Apologizing profusely to Nova and avoiding Ether's gaze, Lorelei allowed Zephyr to lead her out of the loft. The drive home was fraught with silence, the tension between them so thick it was almost suffocating. Lorelei stared out the window, her earlier vivacity replaced by a wary exhaustion. Zephyr gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his jaw clenched as he navigated the nearly empty streets. As they pulled into their driveway, neither made a move to exit the car immediately. For a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them. Finally, Lorelei turned to Zephyr, her voice soft but firm as she said, "We need to talk about this. We can't go on like this." Zephyr nodded stiffly, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Without a word, he got out of the car and headed for the front door. Lorelei followed, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the conversation to come would likely change their lives forever. Neither of them could have predicted just how prophetic that feeling would prove to be. As soon as the front door closed behind them, the facade of calm they had maintained in public crumbled. Zephyr rounded on Lorelei, his face contorted with a mix of anger and pain. The words tumbled out of him in a torrent of accusations and grievances, all the doubts and fears he had been harboring for months finally finding voice. He raged about her behavior at the party, the way she had flirted openly with Ether and others. He brought up past encounters, dissecting them with jealous scrutiny, finding evidence of betrayal in the smallest gestures and glances. His voice rose as he spoke of the coffee plans he had overheard, convinced it was proof of an ongoing affair. Lorelei, initially stunned by the ferocity of Zephyr's outburst, found her own anger rising to meet his. She defended herself vehemently, reminding him that openness and honesty had always been the foundation of their relationship and their foray into swinging. She accused him of hypocrisy, pointing out his own enthusiastic participation in their lifestyle choice until recently. Their argument echoed through the house, a cacophony of hurt feelings and misunderstandings. Lorelei tried to reason with Zephyr, to make him see that his jealousy was unfounded, but her words seemed to bounce off him without making an impact. In frustration, she brought up his own dalliances within the swinging community, asking why it was acceptable for him, but not for her. This only served to enrage Zephyr further. He advanced on Lorelei, his tall frame looming over her as he backed her into a corner of their living room. Lorelei, feeling trapped and increasingly frightened by Zephyr's uncharacteristic aggression, attempted to push past him. In that moment, something in Zephyr snapped. As Lorelei tried to move away, he grabbed her arms, his fingers digging into her skin with bruising force. Lorelei cried out in pain and surprise, her eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at the man she had loved for over a decade, suddenly unrecognizable in his fury. She struggled against his grip, her own anger giving way to fear as she realized how out of control the situation had become. Zephyr, lost in a haze of jealousy and rage, didn't seem to hear her pleas to let go. In her desperation to break free, Lorelei's hand caught Zephyr across the face, her nails leaving angry red scratches on his cheek. The physical contact seemed to push Zephyr over the edge. With a roar of inarticulate rage, he shoved Lorelei hard. She stumbled backwards, her heel catching on the edge of the area rug. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her arms flailing as she tried to catch herself. But there was nothing to break her fall, and her head struck the corner of the solid oak coffee table with a sickening thud. The sound seemed to snap Zephyr out of his frenzy. He stood frozen, watching in horror as Lorelei crumpled to the floor, a small pool of blood beginning to form beneath her head. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Zephyr's ragged breathing. For several long moments, he remained rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then, as if moving through molasses, he stumbled towards Lorelei's motionless form. He fell to his knees beside her, hands shaking as he reached out to touch her. Her skin was still warm, but as he frantically searched for a pulse, he found nothing. The reality of the situation crashed over Zephyr like a tidal wave. He had done the unthinkable. In a moment of uncontrolled anger, he had taken the life of the woman he loved. As the enormity of his actions began to sink in, Zephyr let out a howl of anguish, cradling Lorelei's lifeless body in his arms as tears streamed down his face. In the quiet suburban street outside, a neighbor who had been walking his dog paused, startled by the sound of despair emanating from the Blackwood residence. It was a cry that would haunt the neighborhood for years to come, marking the moment when a loving marriage ended in unimaginable tragedy. The early morning calm of Oak Ridge Heights was shattered by the arrival of police cruisers and an ambulance, their lights painting the tree-lined street in alternating flashes of red and blue. Neighbors emerged from their homes as they watched the unfolding scene, with a mix of curiosity and dread. Detective Rhiannon Frost, a veteran of Homicide Division, arrived on the scene shortly after the first responders. As she ducked under the crime scene tape, she was struck by the contrast between the manicured exterior of the Blackwood home and the chaos that awaited inside. The living room, once a showcase of tasteful decor, now bore the unmistakable signs of violence. The coffee table was askew. A lamp lay shattered on the floor, and at the center of it all was the body of Lorelei Blackwood, partially covered by a sheet. Forensic technicians moved around the room with practiced efficiency, photographing and collecting evidence. Frost's keen eyes took in every detail. Dr. Kai Nakamura briefed her on their initial findings. The cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head, likely from impact with the corner of the coffee table. Signs of a struggle were evident, including bruising on the victim's arms and defensive wounds on her hands. As Nakamura spoke, Frost's attention was drawn to the figure of Zephyr Blackwood, seated on a dining room chair, his head in his hands. He was still wearing the clothes from the previous night's party, now rumpled and stained. A uniformed officer stood nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the distraught husband. Frost approached Zephyr, her experienced gaze noting his scratched cheek and the smears of blood on his shirt. In a voice hoarse from crying, he began to speak, weaving a tale of a party, an argument, and a tragic accident. As she listened, Frost's instincts told her there was more to the story than Zephyr was revealing. His account seemed rehearsed, lacking the raw emotion one would expect from a man who had just lost his wife. She made a mental note to dig deeper into the couple's background and recent activities. Outside, the neighbors huddled in small groups, exchanging shocked whispers and speculative glances. The Blackwoods had always seemed so happy, so perfect. What could have gone so terribly wrong? In the days following Lorelei Blackwood's death, Detective Frost and her team worked tirelessly to piece together the events that led to that fateful night. Their investigation began to reveal a complex web of relationships and hidden tensions that lay beneath the surface of the Blackwoods' seemingly idyllic life. Interviews with friends and colleagues painted a picture of a couple who had recently embraced the swinging lifestyle. While many expressed surprise at this revelation, a select few provided valuable insights into the dynamics of the Blackwoods' open marriage. Nova Sterling, in particular, proved to be a crucial witness, recounting the argument she had witnessed at the party and the obvious tension between Zephyr and Lorelei. As the detectives delved deeper, they uncovered a trail of digital evidence that shed light on the couple's private life. Text messages and emails revealed Zephyr's growing jealousy and Lorelei's increasing frustration with his behavior. Particularly damning was a series of messages between Lorelei and Ether Sterling, discussing Zephyr's recent mood swings and Lorelei's concerns about the future of her marriage. Forensic analysis of the crime scene yielded more damning evidence against Zephyr. The angle and force of Lorelei's fatal injury were inconsistent with a simple fall. DNA evidence under Lorelei's fingernails matched Zephyr's, corroborating the signs of a struggle. Furthermore, toxicology reports showed that while Lorelei had a modest amount of alcohol in her system, Zephyr's blood alcohol level had been significantly higher, suggesting he may have been more impaired than he initially claimed. As the investigation progressed, Detective Frost brought Zephyr in for a series of intense interrogations. Under the relentless pressure of questioning, his carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. Inconsistencies in his story emerged, and his demeanor shifted from grief-stricken widow to a man consumed by guilt and fear. In a dramatic turn of events, Ether Sterling came forward with additional information. He revealed that Lorelei had confided in him about her plans to leave Zephyr, citing his increasingly controlling and jealous behavior. This revelation provided a possible motive for Zephyr's actions, suggesting that the murder may have been premeditated rather than a heat-of-the-moment crime of passion. The investigation also uncovered financial records indicating that Zephyr had recently inquired about the couple's life insurance policies, adding another layer of suspicion to his actions. Friends reported that he had been under increasing stress at work, with rumors of potential layoffs circulating in his company. As the evidence mounted, the prosecution began to build a strong case against Zephyr Blackwood. The narrative that emerged was one of a man who, faced with the prospect of losing both his wife and his carefully cultivated image of success, had lashed out in a jealous rage with tragic consequences. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate the city and beyond, promising to expose the hidden world of suburban swingers and the devastating consequences of jealousy unleashed. Prosecutor Vivian Zhao opened the proceedings with a powerful statement, painting a vivid picture of a marriage destroyed by jealousy and a woman's life cut tragically short. She promised to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Zephyr Blackwood had murdered his wife in a fit of rage, driven by his inability to control her and his fear of losing her. The defense countered with a narrative of a tragic accident, the result of a loving marriage strained by lifestyle choices that neither party was fully prepared for. Holloway sought to portray Zephyr as a devoted husband, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. As the trial progressed, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Nova and Ether Sterling provided crucial testimony about the Blackwoods' involvement in the swinging community and the visible tension between them on the night of Lorelei's death. Their accounts were both illuminating and scandalous, causing a stir in the courtroom and generating salacious headlines. Forensic experts presented detailed analyses of the crime scene, with Dr. Kai Nakamura delivering damning testimony about the nature of Lorelei's injuries. His assertion that the fatal wound was inconsistent with an accidental fall dealt a significant blow to the defense's case. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Zephyr Blackwood himself took the stand. Under Holloway's careful guidance, he presented himself as a man deeply in love with his wife, who had agreed to explore swinging to please her. He spoke of his growing discomfort with the lifestyle and his fears that he was losing Lorelei to it. However, under Zhao's relentless cross-examination, Zephyr's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. She confronted him with text messages, emails, and witness statements that contradicted his version of events. As the questioning intensified, Zephyr's composure slipped, revealing flashes of the anger and jealousy that had led to that fatal night. The gallery watched in rapt attention as Zephyr struggled to maintain his story under the prosecution's onslaught. His voice cracked as he recounted the final argument with Lorelei, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might break down and confess. But he managed to hold himself together, sticking to his claim of a tragic accident to the end. As the trial neared its conclusion, both the prosecution and defense delivered impassioned closing arguments. So urged the jury to see through Zephyr's lies and hold him accountable for the brutal act that had ended Lorelei's life. Holloway, in turn, pleaded for understanding, asking the jury to consider the complex emotions and circumstances that had led to this tragedy. With the evidence presented and arguments made, the case was turned over to the jury. As they filed out to begin deliberations, a tense hush fell over the courtroom. The fate of Zephyr Blackwood now rested in their hands. In the end, the jury took less than 6 hours to reach a verdict. Zephyr Blackwood was found guilty of second-degree murder, a decision that sent shockwaves through the community and brought a measure of closure to Lorelei's grieving family and friends. The judge, citing the brutal nature of the crime and Zephyr's lack of remorse, sentenced him to 25 years to life in prison. The aftermath of the trial left an indelible mark on the community. The case had exposed the hidden world of suburban swingers, leading to heated debates about morality, trust, and the nature of modern relationships. Some couples who had been part of the lifestyle quietly distanced themselves, while others became vocal advocates for ethical non-monogamy, emphasizing the importance of communication and consent. In the end, the tragic story of Zephyr and Lorelei Blackwood served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the strongest relationships can be undone by jealousy, mistrust, and uncontrolled anger. Their story would be remembered not just as a sensational crime, but as a complex human tragedy, born from the eternal struggle between love, desire, and the need for control. At the heart of this tragic tale were two sisters, Jessica and Cassandra Lawrence, whose lives had been intertwined in a complex web of love, rivalry, and resentment since childhood. Cassandra, the elder of the two, had always been the golden child, beautiful, accomplished, and married to the charming and successful architect, Dominic Blunt. Their union was the envy of Millhaven, a seemingly perfect marriage that everyone aspired to emulate. Jessica and Cassandra were born into a family of moderate means, their father a local fisherman, and their mother a schoolteacher. From an early age, it was clear that the two sisters were as different as night and day. Cassandra, with her gentle demeanor, was the pride of her parents. She excelled in school, was beloved by her teachers, and seemed to navigate the social waters of Millhaven with effortless grace. Her path in life seemed predetermined. She would go to college, find a respectable job, and settle down with a good man to start a family of her own. Jessica, however, was a force of nature from the moment she could walk. She possessed a wild spirit that both intrigued and unsettled those around her. While equally intelligent as her sister, Jessica's academic achievements were overshadowed by her rebellious nature and penchant for pushing boundaries. As they grew older, the differences between the sisters only became more pronounced. Cassandra pursued a degree in education, following in her mother's footsteps, while Jessica bounced between various majors, never quite finding her place. It was during this time that Jessica's manipulative tendencies began to surface. She would charm her way out of trouble, using her wit and allure to bend situations to her advantage. Jessica's relationships were always intense but short-lived. She seemed to thrive on the chaos of new romances, only to grow bored once the initial excitement faded. This pattern left a trail of broken hearts and bitter exes in her wake, further cementing her reputation as the black sheep of Millhaven. Cassandra, meanwhile, had returned to her hometown after college and quickly caught the eye of Dominic Blunt, a rising star in the world of architecture. Dominic had come to Millhaven to oversee the restoration of the town's historic lighthouse, but found himself captivated by the town's gentle beauty, both in its landscape and in Cassandra herself. Their courtship was swift and passionate, culminating in a fairy tale wedding that was the talk of the town for months. Dominic's career continued to flourish, and soon he and Cassandra were living in a beautiful home overlooking the ocean, their life together seeming like a modern-day fairy tale. But beneath the surface of their perfect marriage, Cracks were beginning to form. Cassandra, always the dutiful daughter and wife, found herself yearning for something more. She had given up her own dreams of travel and adventure to settle in Millhaven, and a part of her resented the sacrifices she had made for the sake of her marriage. Dominic, for his part, was battling his own demons. The pressure of his high-profile career and the expectations of small-town life weighed heavily on him. He loved Cassandra deeply, but there were moments when he felt suffocated by the perfection they were expected to maintain. It was into this delicate balance that Jessica re-entered their lives, having spent years drifting from city to city. She returned to Millhaven, claiming to want to reconnect with her roots. In reality, she was running from yet another failed relationship and mounting debts, seeking refuge in the only place she knew would take her in. Cassandra, ever the loving sister, welcomed Jessica with open arms, offering her a place to stay until she got back on her feet. But as Jessica settled into life in the Blunt household, the dynamics between the three began to shift in subtle yet profound ways. The stage was set for a drama that would shake Millhaven to its very core, forever altering the lives of all involved. At first, her presence seemed to breathe new life into Cassandra and Dominic's relationship. Evenings were filled with laughter and reminiscence as the sisters caught up on lost time, with Dominic playing the role of the attentive husband and brother-in-law. But as days turned to weeks, Jessica's true intentions began to surface. Her eyes would linger on Dominic a moment too long, her casual touches becoming more frequent and deliberate. She would find excuses to be alone with him, asking for help with her car, seeking advice on job applications, or simply catching him in the kitchen late at night when Cassandra had already gone to bed. Dominic, initially oblivious to Jessica's advances, found himself increasingly drawn to her vibrant personality. Where Cassandra was steady and predictable, Jessica was spontaneous and exciting. She listened with rapt attention to his architectural designs, asking insightful questions that made him feel truly understood. In those moments, Dominic felt a spark he hadn't experienced in years. Dominic was a man of principle, devoted to his wife and the life they had built together. He tried to distance himself from Jessica, making excuses to spend more time at the office or taking on additional projects that kept him away from home. Jessica, however, was not so easily deterred. She recognized the internal struggle in Dominic's eyes and saw it as a challenge rather than a deterrent. She began to weave a careful web of seduction, playing on his insecurities and unfulfilled desires. One evening, as Cassandra attended a school board meeting, Jessica orchestrated a seemingly innocent dinner with Dominic. She prepared his favorite meal, opened a bottle of expensive wine, and created an atmosphere of intimacy that was hard to resist. As they talked late into the night, Jessica carefully steered the conversation towards Dominic's passions and dreams, areas where she knew Cassandra had never fully connected with him. Dominic felt a rush of emotions, flattery, desire, and overwhelming guilt. He stammered a response, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But Jessica had already sensed her advantage. She leaned in closer, her hand brushing against his. "Don't you ever wonder what it would be like to be truly understood? To be with someone who sees you for who you really are?" The tension in the room was palpable. Dominic knew he should leave, should put an end to this dangerous game before it went too far. But something kept him rooted to the spot, caught in the gravitational pull of Jessica's allure. As Jessica's lips met his in a passionate kiss, Dominic's resistance crumbled. In that moment, the foundation of his marriage began to crack, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to unimaginable tragedy. The weeks following that fateful night were a blur of stolen moments and mounting guilt for Dominic. What had begun as a momentary lapse in judgment quickly spiraled into a full-blown affair, with Jessica and Dominic finding increasingly creative ways to be together without arousing Cassandra's suspicions. Their rendezvous ranged from hurried encounters in Dominic's office to carefully planned business trips that allowed them to escape the watchful eyes of Millhaven. Jessica reveled in the thrill of their forbidden romance, each secret meeting fueling her sense of triumph over her sister. For Dominic, the affair was an intoxicating mixture of excitement and self-loathing, each encounter leaving him both exhilarated and racked with guilt. Jessica, ever the master manipulator, knew exactly how to keep Dominic ensnared. She played the role of the perfect lover, alternating between passionate temptress and vulnerable confidant. She would listen to his frustrations about work and his unfulfilled ambitions, offering the understanding and validation he craved. "I've never met anyone like you, Dominic," She would whisper in their intimate moments, "You deserve so much more than this small town can offer you." Her words were carefully chosen, planting seeds of discontent in Dominic's mind about his life with Cassandra. She painted vivid pictures of the future they could have together, a life of excitement and passion, free from the constraints of small-town expectations. Dominic found himself increasingly torn between his growing feelings for Jessica and his loyalty to Cassandra. The double life he was leading began to take its toll, manifesting in mood swings and uncharacteristic behavior that didn't go unnoticed by his wife. At home, Dominic's guilt manifested in a mixture of emotional distance and overcompensation. There were days when he could barely look Cassandra in the eye, and others where he would shower her with affection, driven by remorse. He threw himself into his work, taking on more projects than ever before, using his career as both an escape and an excuse for his frequent absences. Jessica, for her part, played the role of the doting sister-in-law to perfection. She would engage Cassandra in long conversations, feigning interest in her day-to-day life while secretly reveling in her deception. There were moments when a flicker of guilt would cross Jessica's face, a brief recognition of the pain she was causing her sister. But these moments were quickly suppressed, overshadowed by her desire for Dominic and her deep-seated need to finally outshine Cassandra. As the affair progressed, the risks they took became greater. They began meeting in more public places, their need for each other overriding their caution. There were close calls, a neighbor who almost caught them in an embrace, a colleague of Cassandra's who saw them dining together in a neighboring town. Each near discovery only added to the intensity of their relationship, the danger becoming part of the allure. But as weeks turned to months, the strain of their deception began to show. Dominic, once energized by the affair, now found himself constantly on edge. The guilt was eating away at him, affecting his work and his relationships with friends and family. He began to question whether the passion he felt for Jessica was worth the destruction of the life he had built with Cassandra. Jessica, sensing Dominic's internal struggle, doubled down on her efforts to keep him engaged. She became more demanding of his time, more insistent in her declarations of love. Her manipulations became more overt, playing on his guilt and his desires in equal measure. As their affair reached its fever pitch, neither Jessica nor Dominic realized that their carefully constructed house of cards was about to come crashing down. The truth, as it often does, was quietly making its way to the surface, ready to shatter the lives of all involved. While Jessica and Dominic were lost in their passionate affair, Cassandra was slowly piecing together a puzzle she never wanted to solve. At first, the changes were subtle. A lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume on Dominic's clothes, hushed phone conversations that would abruptly end when she entered the room, and an emotional distance that seemed to grow with each passing day. Cassandra, ever the optimist, initially chalked these changes up to work stress or a midlife crisis. She tried to bridge the growing gap between them, planning romantic dinners and weekend getaways, only to be met with half-hearted enthusiasm from Dominic. Her sister Jessica, ironically, became her confidant during this time, offering sympathetic ears and reassurances that only served to twist the knife of betrayal deeper. But as weeks turned to months, Cassandra could no longer ignore the nagging voice in the back of her mind. She began to pay closer attention to the inconsistencies in Dominic's stories about late nights at the office and out-of-town meetings. She noticed the way Jessica's eyes would follow Dominic across a room, the barely concealed hunger in her gaze. One afternoon, while doing laundry, Cassandra found a matchbook from a hotel in a neighboring city tucked into the pocket of Dominic's jacket. A hotel she knew wasn't anywhere near his usual business haunts. The discovery sent a chill down her spine, the physical evidence making it impossible to deny her worst fears any longer. Torn between confronting her suspicions and the fear of what she might uncover, Cassandra found herself in a state of constant anxiety. She began to withdraw from friends and colleagues, unable to bear the thought of sharing her suspicions and making them real. Her sleep was plagued by nightmares, and she found herself watching Dominic and Jessica like a hawk, searching for any sign that would confirm or deny her fears. In a moment of desperation, Cassandra even considered hiring a private investigator, but the thought of strangers prying into her private life was too much to bear. Instead, she decided to confront Dominic and Jessica separately, hoping that one of them would crack under the pressure and reveal the truth. Little did Cassandra know that her decision to seek the truth would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to a confrontation more devastating than she could have ever imagined, forever altering the course of all their lives. The day of reckoning arrived on a stormy afternoon in late autumn. She had spent the morning steeling herself for this moment, rehearsing what she would say, how she would remain calm and collected in the face of potential heartbreak. When Dominic walked through the door, shaking rain from his coat, he was met with the sight of his wife standing in the room, her face a mask of barely contained emotion. The tension in the air was palpable, and he knew instantly that their carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. "We need to talk," she began, her voice quavering slightly despite her best efforts. "I know about you and Jessica." The color drained from Dominic's face, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. In that moment of stunned silence, Cassandra saw the truth written plainly across his features, and her last shred of hope evaporated. "How long?" she demanded, her voice rising. "How long have you been sleeping with my sister?" Dominic's shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew there was no point in denying it any longer. "Cassandra, I'm so sorry, it just happened." Cassandra cut him off with a bitter laugh. "You never meant to? What, did you trip and fall into her bed? How could you do this?" The floodgates opened, and months of pent-up suspicion and hurt came pouring out. Cassandra hurled accusations and questions at Dominic, her voice echoing through the house. Dominic, for his part, could only stand there and absorb her fury, offering weak apologies that did nothing to stem the tide of her anger. As their argument reached a fever pitch, the front door opened, and Jessica walked in, stopping short at the scene before her. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in a tableau of betrayal and guilt. "Jessica, how kind of you to join us. We were just discussing your affair with my husband." Jessica's eyes darted between Cassandra and Dominic, her mind racing to find a way out of this situation. Dominic, torn between the two sisters, tried to intervene. "Please, let's just calm down and talk about this rationally." His words only served to redirect Cassandra's fury. In a fit of rage, Cassandra grabbed a vase from the coffee table and hurled it across the room, narrowly missing Dominic's head. It shattered against the wall, the crash punctuating her words. The noise seemed to snap Jessica out of her defiant stance. For the first time, a flicker of remorse crossed her face. Dominic and Jessica exchanged a look of helpless guilt before slowly making their way to the door. As it closed behind them, Cassandra collapsed onto the sofa, her body racked with sobs. The life she had known, the future she had planned, it had all crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. As the storm raged outside, Cassandra's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, shame, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of loss. In that moment, she made a decision that would set in motion the final tragic act of this sordid drama. The bartender, a grizzled man named Hank, watched with growing concern as Cassandra knocked back drink after drink. He had seen his fair share of patrons drowning their sorrows, but something about the wild look in Cassandra's eyes set him on edge. "Another," Cassandra demanded, her words slightly slurred. Hank hesitated, but the steel in her gaze made him think better of refusing. He poured her another whiskey, neat, silently vowing it would be her last. As the night wore on, the bar emptied out, leaving Cassandra alone with her thoughts and her drinks. The alcohol had dulled the sharp edges of her pain, replacing it with a bitter resolve. Around midnight, Hank gently suggested it was time for her to head home. "Need me to call you a cab, miss?" Cassandra waved him off, fumbling in her purse for her car keys. "I'm fine," she insisted. "I just need to get out of here." Hank reached out to stop her, but Cassandra was already stumbling towards the door. As she stumbled into the parking lot, Cassandra managed to get her car started, the engine roaring to life in the quiet night. She pulled out of the parking lot, her vision blurred and her reactions dangerously slow. The winding coastal road stretched out before her, a ribbon of asphalt barely visible in the moonlight. As she drove, Cassandra's mind was a chaotic whirl of emotions: anger at Dominic and Jessica's betrayal, shame at not having seen the signs earlier, fear of the uncertain future that now lay ahead of her. The speedometer crept higher as she pressed down on the accelerator. It was on a particularly treacherous curve that disaster struck. Cassandra's dulled reflexes failed her, and she took the turn too fast. She felt the car begin to slide, tires screeching against the asphalt. In a moment of terrifying clarity, she realized her mistake, but it was too late. The guardrail gave way with a sickening crunch of metal, and suddenly Cassandra was airborne. Then darkness consumed her as the car plummeted over the cliff's edge, tumbling end over end, towards the jagged rocks below. The first rays of dawn were just breaking over the horizon when Officer Liam Murphy received the call. A jogger had spotted a wrecked car at the bottom of Whispering Cliffs, a notorious stretch of coastline. Murphy, a seasoned member of Millhaven's small police force, felt a sense of dread as he made his way to the scene. The sight that greeted him was grim. The car, a silver sedan, was barely recognizable, having been crushed by the impact and battered by the waves. As the rescue team worked to extract the vehicle from its precarious position, Murphy began the somber task of piecing together what had happened. The license plate, miraculously still intact, quickly identified the car as belonging to Cassandra Blunt. Murphy felt his heart sink. He knew Cassandra, as did most people in Millhaven. The thought of delivering this news to her family weighed heavily on him. As the morning progressed and the full extent of the tragedy became clear, whispers began to circulate through the town. Cassandra Blunt, dead in what appeared to be a drunk driving accident? It seemed impossible. Completely out of character for the woman everyone knew as responsible and level-headed. Detective Sarah Watson, called in from the nearest city to lead the investigation, sensed there was more to the story. Her keen eye noted details that didn't quite add up. The lack of skid marks on the road, suggesting no attempt to brake. The odd angle of the car's trajectory off the cliff. The fact that Cassandra had been drinking alone, something her friends swore she never did. When Watson arrived at the Blunt residence to break the news, she was struck by the palpable tension in the air. Dominic Blunt's reaction to his wife's death seemed oddly muted, tinged with guilt, and the presence of Jessica Lawrence, Cassandra's sister, in the house at such an early hour raised immediate red flags. In the days that followed Cassandra's death, Detective Watson immersed herself in the investigation, peeling back layers of Millhaven's seemingly idyllic surface to reveal the turmoil beneath. Her first step was to retrace Cassandra's final hours, a task that led her to the Rusty Anchor and its reluctant bartender, Hank. Hank's account of Cassandra's state on the night of her death painted a picture of a woman in deep emotional distress. She was knocking them back like there was no tomorrow, he told Watson. Guilt etched on his weathered face. I tried to stop her from driving. This testimony conflicted sharply with everything Watson had heard about Cassandra from friends and colleagues. The woman they described was cautious, responsible, not someone who would drink to excess and then get behind the wheel. The detective's suspicions deepened. Watson's next focus was on Dominic Blunt and Jessica Lawrence. Their behavior since Cassandra's death had been odd, to say the least. Instead of grieving separately, they seemed to be leaning on each other for support, their interactions marked by meaningful glances and hushed conversations that would abruptly cease when others approached. A breakthrough came when Watson interviewed Cassandra's closest friend, Olivia Chen. At first, Olivia was reluctant to speak ill of the dead or cause more pain to the family, but as Watson gently pressed, the floodgates opened. Cassandra had confided in me just days before it happened, Olivia admitted, her voice quavering. She suspected Dominic was having an affair with Jessica. This revelation cast the entire case in a new light. Watson immediately sought to corroborate this information, digging deeper into Dominic and Jessica's recent activities. Bank records showed suspicious transactions, hotel bookings, expensive gifts that aligned with times Dominic had claimed to be on business trips. As the evidence mounted, Watson brought Dominic and Jessica in for separate interviews. Under the detective's relentless questioning, their carefully constructed alibis began to crumble. It was Jessica who broke first. Yes, we were having an affair, she confessed, tears streaming down her face. Cassandra found out that night. We had a huge fight, all three of us. But I swear, we didn't know she'd left the house after we went. Dominic, confronted with Jessica's confession, finally admitted to the affair but vehemently denied any involvement in Cassandra's death. We made a terrible mistake, he said, his voice hollow with regret. But I loved Cassandra. I would never have wanted this. Watson believed they were telling the truth about not directly causing Cassandra's death, but she knew their actions had set the tragic events in motion. The detective's report painted a clear picture. Cassandra, distraught after discovering her husband's infidelity with her own sister, had sought solace in alcohol. Her decision to drive in that state, while ultimately her own, was the direct result of the emotional trauma inflicted by Dominic and Jessica's betrayal. In the end, no criminal charges were filed in relation to Cassandra's death, but in the court of public opinion, Dominic and Jessica were already condemned. The truth of their affair spread through Millhaven like wildfire, forever tarnishing their reputations and ensuring that Cassandra's death would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As time passed, the raw pain of the events began to dull, but their impact on Millhaven remained. The town would eventually regain its outward appearance of tranquility, but its inhabitants carried with them the knowledge that beneath the calm surface of small-town life, passions and secrets could swirl with deadly force. The tragedy of Cassandra Blunt had forever changed the soul of Millhaven, leaving an indelible mark on all who called it home. At the center of this tragic tale were two individuals whose lives became inextricably intertwined. Evelyn Gosling, a 34-year-old English professor at Briarcliff Community College, was known for her brilliant mind and captivating lectures. Zane Holloway, a struggling freshman with dreams of becoming a writer, was drawn to her like a moth to a flame. What began as mentorship slowly twisted into a web of manipulation, desire, and ultimately murder. As investigators peeled back the layers of their relationship, they uncovered a dark tale of exploitation, obsession, twisted fantasies, and deadly desperation. Evelyn Gosling's journey to Briarcliff was paved with academic accolades and personal turmoil. Born to wealthy parents in Boston, Evelyn showed early signs of exceptional intelligence. Her father, a stern investment banker, and her mother, a socialite with a penchant for cocktails, provided Evelyn with every material advantage but little emotional support. From a young age, Evelyn learned to use her intellect as a shield, burying herself in books to escape the cold reality of her home life. She excelled in school, skipping 2 grades and entering Harvard. It was there that Evelyn discovered her passion for English literature and her talent for captivating an audience. After completing her PhD at Yale, Evelyn seemed destined for a prestigious position at an Ivy League institution. However, a scandal involving an affair with her married thesis advisor derailed those plans. The academic community's whispered judgments and thinly veiled rejection drove Evelyn to seek refuge in the small town of Briarcliff. At Briarcliff Community College, Evelyn quickly established herself as a rising star. Her lectures on Renaissance literature and modern poetry drew students from other departments, and her innovative teaching methods earned her the admiration of both colleagues and students. Dr. Gosling was the epitome of success, brilliant, beautiful, and dedicated to her craft. But beneath the polished exterior lay a woman haunted by her past and driven by an insatiable need for validation. Evelyn's relationships were often intense but short-lived, leaving her feeling empty and misunderstood. She craved the adoration of her students, basking in their admiration and subtly encouraging their dependence on her guidance. A psychological evaluation conducted after her arrest would later reveal a complex personality disorder characterized by narcissistic traits and a deep-seated fear of abandonment. It was this dangerous cocktail of intelligence, charisma, and unresolved emotional issues that set the stage for her fateful encounter with Zane Holloway. In him, Evelyn saw not just another student to mold, but a chance to reclaim the youth and passion she felt slipping away. Zane Holloway's path to Briarcliff Community College was far from typical. Born in a working-class neighborhood, Zane was the youngest of 4 children in a family that struggled to make ends meet. His father, a construction worker, spent long hours on job sites, while his mother juggled multiple part-time jobs to keep food on the table. From an early age, Zane found solace in the world of books. While his siblings excelled in sports and practical skills, Zane was the dreamer of the family. He would often be found scribbling stories in tattered notebooks or lost in the pages of worn paperbacks borrowed from the local library. Zane's high school years were marked by academic inconsistency. Brilliant in subjects that captured his imagination, like English and history, he struggled with the rigid structures of math and science. His guidance counselor, Ms. Ramirez, recalled, Zane had a spark of genius when it came to writing, but he lacked the discipline and confidence to truly shine. Despite his potential, Zane's grades were mediocre, and his SAT scores fell short of his aspirations. The rejection letters from his dream colleges were a bitter pill to swallow. But beneath Zane's artistic temperament lay a young man grappling with self-doubt and a desperate need for validation. It was this combination of raw talent, emotional vulnerability, and a burning desire to prove himself that made Zane the perfect target for Evelyn Gosling's manipulation. In her, he saw not just a mentor, but a gateway to the intellectual and artistic world he so desperately wanted to join. As the fall semester began, Zane could never have imagined that his pursuit of literary greatness would lead him down a dark path of ethical compromises, emotional entanglement, and ultimately, to the shores of Lake Briarcliff, where his young life would be cut tragically short. The first day of advanced composition class was a turning point in both Evelyn and Zane's lives, though neither could have predicted the tragic course their paths would take. Evelyn, impeccably dressed in a tailored blazer and pencil skirt, commanded the room with her presence. Her eyes scanned the sea of fresh faces, pausing momentarily on Zane, hunched in the back row, nervously fiddling with his pen. As Evelyn launched into her introductory lecture on the power of narrative, Zane found himself captivated. Her words seemed to speak directly to him, igniting a passion he had long kept buried. When she asked the class to share their favorite authors, Zane surprised himself by raising his hand. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke of his admiration for James Baldwin, earning an approving nod from Evelyn. After class, Evelyn approached Zane. She'd been impressed by his insight and encouraged him to consider submitting work to the college literary magazine. Zane, flushed with pride, stammered his thanks. This brief interaction planted the seeds of what would become a dangerous obsession for both of them. Over the next few weeks, Zane became a fixture in Evelyn's office hours. What began as discussions about assignments gradually evolved into deep conversations about literature, life, and Zane's aspirations. Evelyn, recognizing Zane's raw talent and vulnerability, began to subtly shape their interactions. She would lean in closely when reviewing his work, her perfume lingering in the air. Her feedback was a careful mix of praise and criticism, designed to keep Zane constantly seeking her approval. She shared personal anecdotes, creating an illusion of intimacy that blurred the lines of the student-teacher relationship. Zane's classmate Amelia later told investigators, "We all noticed how Dr. Gosling treated Zane differently. At first, we were just jealous of the attention, but looking back, there was something off about it." As midterms approached, Zane was struggling in his other classes. The pressure to maintain his scholarship weighed heavily on him. Sensing his distress, Evelyn made her first overt move. After a particularly long office meeting, she placed her hand on Zane's arm and spoke softly. "I see so much potential in you, Zane. I'd hate to see it go to waste because of a few difficult classes. Perhaps we could work out an arrangement to ensure your success." Zane, naive and desperate to prove himself, failed to recognize the dangerous territory he was entering. He interpreted Evelyn's offer as a lifeline, a chance to focus on his true passion without the fear of losing his scholarship. As autumn painted the Briarcliff campus in shades of gold and red, Evelyn and Zane's relationship intensified. She invited him to exclusive literary events, introducing him to her colleagues as a promising protégé. Zane, intoxicated by this new world of intellectual stimulation and perceived belonging, began to rely on Evelyn for more than just academic guidance. Evelyn, for her part, reveled in Zane's dependence. She carefully crafted every interaction to deepen his emotional attachment while maintaining plausible deniability. To her colleagues, she was merely nurturing a gifted student. To Zane, she became the center of his world. By the time the fall semester was coming to a close, the boundaries between mentor and student had become irrevocably blurred. Zane's writing, once filled with diverse influences, now mimicked Evelyn's style and preferences. His social circle had shrunk, with more and more of his time devoted to extra study sessions with Dr. Gosling. Neither Zane nor Evelyn fully realized the dangerous web they were weaving. As the winter break approached, their relationship teetered on the brink of a precipice, ready to plunge into depths from which there would be no return. The winter break marked a critical turning point in Evelyn and Zane's relationship. With the campus largely deserted, they found themselves drawn into a vortex of intensifying emotions and crossed boundaries. Evelyn, under the guise of providing additional mentorship, invited Zane to her off-campus apartment to discuss his final paper for her class. The evening began innocently enough, with Evelyn serving tea and engaging Zane in a heated debate about postmodern literature. But as the hours wore on and inhibitions lowered, the atmosphere shifted. Evelyn, her voice lowered to a near whisper, began to share personal stories of her own struggles as a young academic. She portrayed herself as a misunderstood genius, persecuted by jealous colleagues, and bound by the rigid structures of academia. Zane, already in awe of Evelyn's intellect, found himself drawn deeper into her world. He saw in her a kindred spirit, someone who truly understood the artist's struggle. When Evelyn's hand brushed against his, the electric charge between them was undeniable. What happened next would be a point of contention in the later investigation. Evelyn claimed that Zane initiated the kiss, overcome by youthful passion. Zane, in his final statement, insisted that Evelyn had orchestrated the entire evening to this end. Regardless of who made the first move, that night marked the beginning of a physical relationship that would have devastating consequences. As the new semester began, Evelyn and Zane's secret affair intensified. Clandestine meetings in her office turned into long weekends at secluded bed and breakfasts. Evelyn showered Zane with gifts: rare books, expensive pens, a laptop to replace his outdated model. She framed each gift as an investment in his future as a writer, further binding him to her. Zane's grades, which had been middling in his other classes, suddenly skyrocketed. Evelyn used her influence to intervene on his behalf with other professors, painting him as a misunderstood genius who simply needed the right guidance. She promised Zane that with her help, he could secure a spot in a prestigious MFA program, bypassing the usual requirements. But as Zane's dependence on Evelyn grew, so did his anxiety. The initial thrill of their forbidden romance began to give way to guilt and fear of discovery. His writing, once vibrant and unique, became a pale imitation of Evelyn's style. His few remaining friends noticed his increasing isolation and erratic behavior. Evelyn, sensing Zane's unease, doubled down on her manipulation. She alternated between lavish praise and cruel criticism, keeping Zane in a constant state of emotional turmoil. She convinced him that their relationship was special, a meeting of twin souls that the ordinary world could never understand. In a particularly chilling move, Evelyn began to insinuate that Zane's success was entirely dependent on her goodwill. During one tense encounter in her office, she casually remarked, "It would be a shame if the ethics board were to investigate the sudden improvement in your grades. They might get the wrong idea about how you've been earning them." The implied threat was clear. Zane, trapped between his ambition and his growing sense of moral unease, began to withdraw into himself. His journal entries from this period, later recovered by investigators, paint a picture of a young man in deep emotional distress. February 15th, "I don't know who I am anymore. Everything I've achieved feels tainted. But how can something so wrong feel so necessary?" March 3rd, "E says she's the only one who truly understands me. Maybe she's right. The thought of losing her terrifies me more than anything." As spring bloomed on the Briarcliff campus, the web of lies and manipulation had grown so thick that Zane could scarcely remember his life before Evelyn. His family, worried by his increasingly infrequent calls home, planned a surprise visit. Evelyn, paranoid about discovery, forced Zane to rebuff them, causing a painful rift. It was during this time that Zane began to confide in his roommate, Trevor. While he didn't reveal the full extent of his relationship with Evelyn, he shared enough for Trevor to become deeply concerned. Trevor's worried glances and pointed questions about Zane's relationship with Dr. Gosling would later prove to be the thread that would begin to unravel the whole sordid affair. As the semester neared its end, the pressure on both Evelyn and Zane intensified. Their relationship, built on a foundation of manipulation and false promises, was beginning to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. Neither could have predicted the violent culmination that lay just around the corner, a tragic end to a romance that should never have begun. The catalyst for the tragic events that followed came in the form of a seemingly innocuous email. Dr. Fiona Sullivan, the Dean of Liberal Arts, reached out to Evelyn about Zane's remarkable academic turnaround, expressing interest in featuring him in a college newsletter. For Evelyn, this well-intentioned inquiry set off alarm bells. The thought of increased scrutiny on Zane's achievements filled her with panic. In a frenzy, Evelyn called Zane to her office after hours. The tension was palpable as she paced the room, outlining the danger they were in. Zane, already worn down by months of emotional manipulation, felt the last vestiges of his self-worth crumbling. It was in this charged atmosphere that Zane finally found the courage to confront the reality of their situation. His voice barely above a whisper, he said, "This isn't right, Evelyn. What we're doing is destroying me." Evelyn's reaction was swift and cruel. Her nurturing facade cracked, revealing the ruthless manipulator beneath. She reminded Zane of all she had done for him, how his success was entirely due to her influence. In a chilling moment, she asked, "Do you really think you'd be anything without me? You're nothing but a small-town boy with delusions of grandeur. I made you." Zane, his eyes open to the toxic nature of their relationship, felt a surge of anger and self-preservation. He shot back, "This ends now. I'm going to tell the dean everything." The color drained from Evelyn's face. Her carefully constructed world teetered on the brink of collapse. In a last-ditch effort to maintain control, she alternated between threats and pleas, reminding Zane of the consequences they would both face if the truth came to light. But something had shifted in Zane. The fog of infatuation and manipulation had lifted, revealing the stark reality of his situation. He turned to leave, his hand on the doorknob, when Evelyn's voice, now ice-cold, stopped him. "If you walk out that door, I'll make sure you never write again." Zane paused, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, without turning back, he walked out, leaving Evelyn alone with the ruins of her twisted fantasy. The following days were a blur for both Zane and Evelyn. Zane, emboldened by his decision, confided the full extent of the affair to his roommate Trevor. Together, they decided to approach Dean Sullivan with the truth. Evelyn, meanwhile, spiraled into panic. She alternated between desperate attempts to contact Zane and frantic efforts to cover her tracks. She deleted emails, shredded documents, and called in favors from colleagues to vouch for her character. As Zane prepared to meet with the dean, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Evelyn's threats echoed in his mind, but he was determined to reclaim his life and his integrity. Little did he know that Evelyn, driven to the brink by the imminent exposure of her crimes, was formulating a desperate and deadly plan to silence him forever. On the night of the murder, Zane Holloway left the library just after midnight, his mind preoccupied with the meeting he had scheduled with Dean Sullivan the following morning. As he walked along the deserted path that skirted the lake, he failed to notice the figure emerging from the shadows behind him. Evelyn Gosling had spent the day in a state of frenzied planning. Her rational mind had been overwhelmed by a toxic mix of fear, rage, and desperation. In her distorted reality, silencing Zane had become the only way to preserve the life she had built. She had waited for hours, watching the library entrance, a large rock clutched in her trembling hands. As Zane approached a secluded bend in the path, Evelyn made her move. The first blow caught Zane by surprise, sending him stumbling forward. He turned, shock and betrayal etched on his face as he recognized his attacker. "Evelyn, I trusted you," he gasped. But Evelyn was beyond reason. With a strength born of desperation, with a rock in her hand, she struck again and again while he was on the ground. Zane's attempts to defend himself were weakened by his reluctance to hurt the woman he had once admired and loved. In the aftermath of her violent act, Evelyn stood frozen, the reality of what she had done crashing over her. The fog seemed to close in, muffling the sound of Zane's body as it slid down the embankment into the dark waters of the lake. With mechanical efficiency, Evelyn began to cover her tracks. She gathered Zane's scattered belongings, wiping them clean of fingerprints before tossing them into the water. She scoured the area for any evidence that might link her to the scene. As the first light of dawn began to break through the mist, Evelyn made her way back to her apartment, her clothes sodden and muddied. Over the next few days, Evelyn attempted to maintain a facade of normalcy. She taught her classes, attended faculty meetings, all while battling the internal chaos of her guilt and fear. When Zane was reported missing, she feigned concern, even joining search parties organized by the college. But the weight of her actions took its toll. Colleagues noted her distracted demeanor and uncharacteristic nervousness. A psychology professor who had known Evelyn for years later recalled, "There was a wildness in her eyes, a tension in her movements. It was as if she was constantly on the verge of flight." Evelyn's carefully constructed alibi began to unravel almost immediately. The rock she had used as a weapon, hastily discarded in the dumpster behind her apartment building, was discovered by a maintenance worker. Security camera footage placed her car near the lake on the night of Zane's disappearance, contradicting her claim of being home all night. As the investigation intensified, Evelyn's paranoia reached new heights. She became convinced that everyone knew her secret. In a moment of panic, she attempted to flee, hastily packing a bag and withdrawing large sums of cash from her bank account. It was this erratic behavior that ultimately led to her undoing. Zane's body, weighed down by rocks, was discovered by a group of students on a weekend fishing trip. The grim discovery sent shockwaves through the Briarcliff community and marked the beginning of the end for Evelyn Gosling. The discovery of Zane Holloway's body transformed the missing person case into a full-blown homicide investigation. Detective Samantha Reeves, a veteran of the Briarcliff Police Department, took charge of the case. Her first steps were to secure the crime scene and order a comprehensive forensic analysis of the area surrounding Lake Briarcliff. The autopsy revealed that Zane had died from blunt force trauma to the head, with drowning as a secondary cause of death. The medical examiner noted defensive wounds on Zane's arms, indicating he had tried to protect himself from his attacker. As news of the murder spread, the idyllic campus of Briarcliff Community College became a hotbed of speculation and fear. Students whispered in hallways, casting suspicious glances at their peers and professors. The administration, desperate to control the narrative, held conferences assuring parents and the community that this was an isolated incident. Detective Reeves and her team began the painstaking process of interviewing Zane's friends, family, and associates. It was during these initial interviews that Zane's roommate, Trevor Lawson, provided the first crucial lead. Trevor revealed Zane's troubled relationship with Professor Gosling, including vague references to an arrangement that had left Zane increasingly distressed in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. This information led investigators to take a closer look at Evelyn Gosling. On the surface, she appeared to be a grieving mentor, distraught over the loss of a promising student. However, as detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies in her story began to emerge. A breakthrough came when forensic analysts discovered traces of soil on the rock used to attack Zane that matched samples from Evelyn's garden. Additionally, security footage from a gas station near Lake Briarcliff showed Evelyn's car in the area on the night of the murder, contradicting her alibi. As the evidence mounted, Evelyn's colleagues began to come forward with their own observations. A professor from the psychology department recalled a disturbing conversation with Evelyn just days before Zane's disappearance. She seemed agitated, he told investigators. She kept talking about how she couldn't let everything she'd worked for be destroyed by a misunderstanding. The investigation took another turn when detectives uncovered a series of emails between Evelyn and Zane. While carefully worded, the subtext of these messages hinted at an inappropriate relationship. IT specialists recovered deleted drafts of emails from Evelyn's college account that were far more explicit, detailing her manipulation of Zane and her fears of exposure. The search of Evelyn's apartment yielded damning evidence. Hidden in a locked drawer, detectives found Zane's journal, which detailed the evolution of their relationship and his growing desire to end it. With the wealth of physical evidence and witness testimony, the district attorney's office felt confident in charging Evelyn Gosling with first-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, shattering the image of the brilliant, dedicated professor and exposing the dark underbelly of power dynamics in academia. As Evelyn was led away in handcuffs, the true scope of her deception began to unravel, leaving the Briarcliff community to grapple with the question of how such a predator had hidden in plain sight for so long. Over the next several hours, Evelyn's full confession emerged, painting a disturbing picture of manipulation, abuse of power, and ultimately, murder. She spoke of her initial attraction to Zane's talent and vulnerability, how easy it had been to shape him to her will. Her voice filled with bitterness as she recounted Zane's decision to expose their relationship, describing it as a betrayal that left her no option but to silence him permanently. The trial of Evelyn Gosling was brief but intense. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, from forensic analysis to Evelyn's own confession. Despite a vigorous defense attempting to paint her as a victim of her own mental illness, the jury took only 6 hours to return a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge, her voice heavy with the weight of the moment, sentenced Evelyn to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The aftermath of the trial saw significant changes at Briarcliff Community College. The administration implemented strict new guidelines governing faculty-student interactions, and mandatory training on recognizing and reporting inappropriate behavior was instituted. As Briarcliff slowly began to heal, the tragedy left an indelible mark on the community. The shores of Lake Briarcliff, once a place of tranquility and reflection, now stood as a somber reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the most respectable facades, and the tragic consequences when trust is abused and power is unchecked. Remington Harlow, a successful software engineer, and his wife Cordelia, a talented interior designer, were the picture of marital bliss to their friends and neighbors. Their home, with its manicured lawn and white picket fence, stood as a testament to their seemingly perfect life. But beneath the surface, a dark current was stirring. Remington's growing fascination with a taboo fantasy would set in motion a chain of events that would shatter their idyllic existence and end in tragedy. What began as a consensual exploration of desires would spiral into a maelstrom of jealousy, betrayal, and ultimately murder. Remington Harlow was born in 1985 to a middle-class family in Eugene. From an early age, he displayed a keen intellect and a fascination with computers. His parents, both educators, nurtured his interests, and by the time he entered high school, Remington was already coding his own programs. Despite his academic prowess, he struggled socially, often feeling awkward and out of place among his peers. Cordelia Astor, born in 1987, grew up in a wealthy family in Seattle, Washington. The youngest of 3 children, she was vivacious and creative from the start. Her parents, successful real estate developers, provided her with every opportunity, including art classes and interior design courses. Their paths crossed in 2005 at Reed College in Portland. Remington, a junior computer science major, literally bumped into Cordelia, a freshman art student in the campus library. He was immediately smitten by her radiant smile and effortless charm. Cordelia, in turn, found herself drawn to Remington's quiet intensity and brilliant mind. Their courtship was a whirlwind of intellectual discussions, late-night coding sessions, where Cordelia would sketch while Remington typed, and explorations of Portland's eclectic art scene. Despite their different backgrounds and personalities, they found in each other a perfect complement. They married in 2009, shortly after Cordelia's graduation. The wedding, held in a picturesque vineyard in the Willamette Valley, was a joyous affair that seemed to portend a bright future. Remington had already secured a high-paying job at a tech startup in Portland, while Cordelia began to make a name for herself in the city's competitive interior design market. For the first few years of their marriage, life seemed perfect. They bought their dream home in Oak Ridge, traveled the world, and built a wide circle of friends. Remington's career soared as he climbed the corporate ladder, eventually becoming a senior engineer at a tech firm. Cordelia's design business flourished, with her work featured in several magazines. From the outside, the Harlows appeared to have it all: successful careers, a beautiful home, and a strong, loving marriage. But as they entered their 30s, subtle cracks began to form in their seemingly flawless facade, setting the stage for the tumultuous events to come. As the Harlows approached their 10th wedding anniversary, a restlessness began to creep into their relationship. The passion that had once burned so brightly had dimmed to a comfortable, but sometimes monotonous glow. Remington, always introspective, found himself increasingly drawn to online forums and discussions about alternative sexual lifestyles. It started innocently enough, a curiosity about what other couples did to spice up their love lives. But as Remington delved deeper into these virtual communities, he became particularly fascinated by the concept of cuckolding. The idea of watching his wife with another man, of being a voyeur to her pleasure, awakened something within him. At first, Remington kept these thoughts to himself, ashamed and confused by the intensity of his desires. He would stay up late, ostensibly working, but in reality, he was consuming every piece of cuckold-related content he could find. Cordelia, perceptive as ever, sensed the change in her husband. She noticed his distraction, the way his eyes would sometimes glaze over during their conversations, the increased frequency of his late nights at the computer. Concerned, she gently probed, asking if everything was all right, if work was becoming too stressful. Finally, after weeks of internal struggle, Remington decided to broach the subject with Cordelia. One evening over a bottle of wine, he haltingly confessed his newfound interest. He spoke of his desires, his curiosity about exploring this fantasy, all the while watching Cordelia's face for signs of disgust or rejection. To his surprise and relief, Cordelia didn't recoil. Instead, she listened with an open mind, asking thoughtful questions about what exactly appealed to him about this scenario. While she expressed initial reservations, she also admitted to a certain intrigue. The idea of being desired by another man, of being the center of attention, held its own allure. This conversation marked a turning point in their marriage. What had been a private fantasy for Remington was now out in the open, a possibility to be explored together. Neither of them could have predicted the profound impact this revelation would have on their lives, or the dangerous path it would ultimately lead them down. The Harlows' foray into the world of cuckolding began cautiously. They set ground rules, discussed boundaries, and agreed to take things slowly. But finding the right person to introduce into their marriage proved challenging. They wanted someone attractive and charismatic, but also discreet and respectful of their arrangement. Enter Thaddeus Blackwood. Cordelia met him at a charity art auction in downtown Portland. Tall, with piercing green eyes, Thaddeus exuded a magnetic charm that drew people to him. As the owner of a successful art gallery, he moved effortlessly through Portland's cultural elite, his wit and knowledge making him the center of attention at any gathering. Cordelia was immediately drawn to Thaddeus's sophisticated aura. They spent the evening in animated conversation about emerging artists and the latest trends in interior design. When Thaddeus casually mentioned being unattached and open to new experiences, Cordelia felt a spark of excitement. She relayed her encounter to Remington that night, watching his eyes light up as she described Thaddeus. They agreed that he might be the perfect candidate for their exploration. Remington encouraged Cordelia to nurture the connection, his excitement palpable. Over the next few weeks, Cordelia and Thaddeus met for coffee several times, ostensibly to discuss potential collaborations between his gallery and her design firm. Each time, Cordelia returned home to regale Remington with stories of their encounters, stoking the flames of his fantasy. Finally, after a particularly flirtatious meeting, Cordelia decided it was time to broach the subject with Thaddeus. To her surprise and delight, he was intrigued by the proposition. He admitted to having participated in similar arrangements before and understood the delicacy required. With Thaddeus on board, the stage was set for the Harlows to turn fantasy into reality. Little did they know that this decision would set in motion a series of events that would irrevocably change their lives. The night of the first encounter arrived with a mix of nervous energy and excited anticipation. Remington and Cordelia had spent weeks planning every detail, from the ambient lighting in their bedroom to the bottle of expensive champagne chilling in an ice bucket. Thaddeus arrived at 8 p.m. sharp, looking dashing in a tailored charcoal suit. He brought with him a bouquet of exotic flowers for Cordelia and a rare bottle of scotch for Remington, a gesture that impressed them both with its thoughtfulness. The evening began in the living room with drinks and light conversation. Thaddeus regaled them with stories from the art world, his charisma on full display. Cordelia, dressed in a slinky black dress, laughed at his jokes and touched his arm with increasing frequency. Remington watched from his armchair, a tumbler of scotch in hand, his heart racing with every interaction between his wife and their guest. As the night progressed and the alcohol flowed, the atmosphere grew charged with sexual tension. Finally, with a meaningful look at Remington, Cordelia took Thaddeus by the hand and led him upstairs. In the bedroom, Remington settled into a corner armchair as Cordelia and Thaddeus began to kiss passionately. When Thaddeus and Cordelia finally fell onto the bed, their bodies entwined, Remington felt a potent mix of arousal and an unexpected twinge of jealousy. The encounter itself was intense and passionate. Remington watched, transfixed, as his fantasy played out before his eyes. The reality was more visceral, more overwhelming than he had imagined. Afterwards, as they all lay spent and silent, Remington felt a complex swirl of emotions. There was satisfaction, certainly. His long-held fantasy had been realized, but there was also a nagging sense of unease, a feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Thaddeus left shortly after, with promises to stay in touch. As Remington and Cordelia lay in bed, discussing the evening's events in hushed, excited tones, neither could have predicted how this first encounter would set the stage for the tragedy to come. They had opened Pandora's box, and there would be no closing it again. Encouraged by the success of their first foray into cuckolding, they eagerly arranged more meetings with Thaddeus. What had started as a monthly indulgence quickly became then weekly. Each encounter seemed to push the boundaries further, with Thaddeus staying longer, the sessions growing more intense and intimate. Remington's role began to evolve as well. Cordelia said in an interview that he was initially content to watch from afar. He found himself drawn closer to the action. Sometimes he would join in, and that the dynamics of power and control within their bedroom became increasingly complex. Outside of their encounters, Thaddeus began to integrate more into their lives. He would join them for dinner, accompany Cordelia to art exhibitions, even spend weekends at their home. His charm and wit made him a delightful companion, and the Harlows found themselves enjoying his company even when action wasn't on the agenda. As spring turned to summer, Remington's initial excitement began to give way to a gnawing sense of discomfort. He started to notice small but significant changes in Cordelia's behavior. She seemed distracted during their alone time, her mind elsewhere. She began to dress up more often, even on days when they had no plans with Thaddeus. One evening, Remington came home early from work to find Cordelia on the phone, speaking in hushed, intimate tones. When she saw him, she quickly ended the call, claiming it was just a client. But Remington couldn't shake the feeling that she had been talking to Thaddeus. In bed, Cordelia's passion seemed to have cooled. She was still enthusiastic during their encounters with Thaddeus, but alone with Remington, she often seemed tired or disinterested. Remington found himself initiating sex more often, only to be gently rebuffed. Remington tried to reassert control over the situation. He suggested taking a break from their arrangement, perhaps going on a vacation, just the two of them. But Cordelia seemed reluctant, always finding reasons to delay or change the subject. His work began to suffer as he spent hours analyzing every interaction, every text message, every glance between Cordelia and Thaddeus. He started checking Cordelia's phone when she wasn't looking, scrutinizing her social media activity, even contemplating following her when she went out alone. Remington knew he was spiraling, but he felt powerless to stop it. The game he had initiated was slipping out of his control, and he was terrified of losing Cordelia. As his anxiety grew, so did his determination to put an end to the situation he had created, by any means necessary. The breaking point came on a warm July evening. Remington had planned a romantic dinner at home, hoping to reconnect with Cordelia and discuss his growing concerns. He had left work early, bought her favorite wine, and spent hours preparing an elaborate meal. But as the sun began to set and the candles burned low, Cordelia was nowhere to be seen. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Hours ticked by, the carefully prepared food growing cold on the table. When she finally stumbled in shortly before midnight, her hair disheveled and lipstick smudged, Remington's worst fears seemed confirmed. The argument that ensued was explosive. Remington, his emotions amplified by alcohol and hours of anxious waiting, unleashed all the fears and suspicions he'd been harboring. He accused Cordelia of falling in love with Thaddeus, of making a fool of him, of destroying their marriage. Cordelia, caught off guard and defensive, initially tried to deflect. She claimed she'd lost track of time at a client meeting, that her phone had died. But faced with Remington's relentless questioning and the evidence of her appearance, she finally broke down and admitted she had been with Thaddeus. The confession hit Remington like a physical blow. He had suspected, had feared, but hearing it confirmed shattered something inside him. In that moment, all the excitement and thrill of their arrangement went away. Cordelia, tears streaming down her face, tried to explain. She loved Remington, she insisted, but Thaddeus made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. She was confused, torn between her loyalty to her husband and her deepening emotions for Thaddeus. Remington, his voice low and dangerous, demanded that she end things with Thaddeus immediately. Cordelia, her own anger rising, refused. This had been Remington's idea in the first place, she argued. He couldn't dictate her feelings or control her relationships. The argument escalated, with both of them saying hurtful things they would later regret. Remington, in a moment of rage, smashed a wine glass against the wall. Cordelia, shocked by this uncharacteristic display of violence, retreated to the guest bedroom, locking the door behind her. Remington spent the night on the couch, his mind racing, unable to sleep. In the days following their confrontation, a chilling calm settled over the Harlow household. Cordelia and Remington moved around each other like ghosts, barely speaking, the tension palpable. Cordelia spent most of her time out of the house, throwing herself into her work, and Remington suspected meeting with Thaddeus. Remington, for his part, retreated into a dark place within himself. He called in sick to work, spending his days in a haze of alcohol and paranoid thoughts. He scoured Cordelia's computer and phone for evidence of her relationship with Thaddeus, meticulously documenting every text, every call, every unexplained absence. Remington began to fantasize about confronting Thaddeus, about making him pay for destroying his marriage. At first, these were just harmless daydreams, a way to vent his frustration. But as the days wore on and Cordelia grew more distant, these fantasies took on a darker, more violent tone. One afternoon, while Cordelia was at a client meeting, Remington found himself in their garage holding the heavy wrench he used for home repairs. As he felt its weight in his hand, a chilling thought crossed his mind. It should be so easy to end this, and to eliminate the threat to his marriage once and for all. Horrified by the direction of his thoughts, Remington dropped the wrench and fled the garage. But the seed had been planted. As he paced the house, gulping down glasses of whiskey, the idea took root and grew. By the time night fell, what had started as a fleeting, horrifying thought had crystallized into a plan. August 15th dawned hot and humid, the air heavy with the promise of an approaching storm. Remington woke early, his head pounding from another night of heavy drinking, but his resolve unwavering. Today would be the day he confronted Thaddeus, the day he reclaimed control over his life and his marriage. He spent the morning in a feverish state of preparation. He showered, shaved, and dressed with meticulous care as if preparing for an important business meeting rather than the violent confrontation he was planning. In the garage, he selected the wrench he had held days earlier, wrapping it in a towel and placing it in a nondescript gym bag. Cordelia left for work around 9 a.m., barely acknowledging Remington as she rushed out the door. As soon as she was gone, Remington got into his car and drove to Thaddeus's gallery. He parked across the street, watching as Thaddeus arrived, greeting his employees with his characteristic charm. For hours, Remington sat in his car. As closing time approached, Remington watched Thaddeus bid goodbye to his last customer and begin closing up the gallery. This was the moment he had been waiting for. With shaking hands, he grabbed the gym bag and crossed the street. Thaddeus was locking the gallery door when Remington approached. He turned, surprise flickering across his face before it settled into a wary smile. "Remington," he said, "this is unexpected. Is everything all right?" Remington felt a surge of rage at Thaddeus's casual tone, as if he hadn't been destroying Remington's life for months. Without conscious thought, he swung the gym bag, catching Thaddeus off guard and sending him stumbling back against the gallery door. What followed was a blur of violence and desperation. Remington pulled out the wrench, swinging it wildly as Thaddeus tried to defend himself. But Remington was beyond reason. Every blow was fueled by months of jealousy, insecurity, and rage. When it was over, Remington stood panting over Thaddeus's motionless body, the wrench slick with blood in his trembling hand. The reality of what he had done crashed over him like a tidal wave. He had just killed a man. He had just destroyed his own life in a futile attempt to save it. Remington went through the motions of covering his tracks. He dragged Thaddeus's body into the alley behind the gallery, hiding it behind a dumpster. He wiped down the door handle and any surfaces he might have touched. Then, still in a state of shock, he drove home, the weight of his actions settling over him like a shroud. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as Remington pulled into his driveway, the rain washing away the blood on his hands, but doing nothing to cleanse his conscience. The hours following the murder passed in a nightmarish blur for Remington. He stumbled into the house, barely making it to the bathroom before violently emptying the contents of his stomach. As the adrenaline wore off, the full impact of his actions hit him. He had killed a man. He was a murderer. Operating on autopilot, Remington set about destroying evidence. He burned his clothes in the backyard fire pit, scrubbed the car clean, and took a shower. When Cordelia came home, Remington had composed himself enough to feign normalcy. He greeted her with forced cheerfulness, suggesting they order takeout and watch a movie. As they sat on the couch, the TV flickering unwatched, Remington's mind raced. He knew it was only a matter of time before Thaddeus's body was discovered. He needed an alibi, a story to tell when the inevitable questions came. He casually mentioned to Cordelia that he had spent the day at home catching up on work and doing some yard work. He even showed her a small cut on his hand, claiming he had nicked himself while pruning the rose bushes, a cut that had actually come from his struggle with Thaddeus. 2 days after the murder, the news broke. Thaddeus Blackwood, prominent art dealer and fixture of Portland's cultural scene, had been found dead behind his shop. The police were treating it as a homicide. Remington learned of the discovery while at work, overhearing colleagues discussing the shocking news. He felt the blood drain from his face, his hands shaking so badly he had to excuse himself to the restroom. The investigation moved quickly. Detective Eliana Rossi, a veteran of the Police Bureau's Homicide Division, took charge of the case. She and her team combed through Thaddeus's life, interviewing friends, family, and business associates. It didn't take long for them to uncover Thaddeus's relationship with the Harlows. Cordelia, devastated by the news of Thaddeus's death, initially tried to downplay their connection, but faced with evidence from Thaddeus's phone records and witness accounts, she eventually admitted to their affair. When the police came to interview Remington, he was prepared. He expressed shock and sadness at Thaddeus's death, acknowledging that while their arrangement had been unconventional, he had considered Thaddeus a friend. He calmly recounted his movements on the day of the murder, his story aligning perfectly with what he had told Cordelia. Detective Rossi, however, sensed something off about Remington's demeanor. His calm seemed forced, his grief a touch too performative. She made a mental note to dig deeper into his background and movements. As the investigation progressed, the police began to piece together a timeline of Thaddeus's last day. Security footage from nearby businesses showed him entering the gallery in the morning but never leaving. His last phone call had been to Cordelia, ending abruptly around closing time. The net was slowly closing around Remington. As the days turned into weeks, Cordelia's grief over Thaddeus's death deepened. She threw herself into her work, often staying late at the office, avoiding the stilted silences that now characterized her home life with Remington. At first, Remington's attentiveness in the wake of the tragedy had touched her. He seemed genuinely concerned for her well-being, always ready with a comforting word or a shoulder to cry on. But as time passed, she began to notice inconsistencies in his behavior. Cordelia found herself revisiting the events leading up to Thaddeus's death. She remembered Remington's jealousy, his desperate pleas for her to end the affair. The more she thought about it, the more a terrible suspicion began to take root in her mind. She started paying closer attention to Remington's actions, noting when he left the house, checking his browser history when he wasn't around. She even considered hiring a private investigator, but couldn't bring herself to take that final step. As her suspicions grew, so did her fear. If Remington was capable of what she was beginning to suspect, what else might he be capable of? For the first time in their marriage, Cordelia found herself afraid of her husband, unsure of the man she had promised to love for better or worse. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. A homeless man, known to frequent the alley behind Thaddeus's gallery, came forward with information. He claimed to have seen a man matching Remington's description entering the alley on the night of the murder, carrying a gym bag. This new lead energized the investigation. Detective Rossi and her team began to scrutinize Remington's movements more closely. They discovered traffic camera footage that contradicted his alibi, showing his car near the gallery around the time of the murder. As the evidence mounted, Remington's behavior became increasingly erratic. He started drinking heavily, snapping at colleagues, and becoming paranoid about being followed. Cordelia, her own suspicions now seeming confirmed, began to distance herself from him, staying with a friend under the guise of needing space to grieve. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the police, armed with a search warrant, found small traces of blood in Remington's car that matched Thaddeus's DNA. They also discovered the murder weapon, the blood-stained wrench that Remington had hidden in the attic, unable to bring himself to dispose of it completely. On a rainy September morning, nearly a month after Thaddeus's death, Detective Rossi arrived at the Harlow residence with a team of officers. They found Remington sitting in the living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. As the detective read him his rights, Remington offered no resistance. In that moment, he felt an odd sense of relief. The game was over. The lies, the fear, the constant vigilance. It could all stop now. Remington Harlow's trial was brief but sensational. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, his confession a rambling account of jealousy, fantasy, and fatal obsession. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Cordelia, shattered by the revelation of her husband's actions, filed for divorce shortly after his arrest. She sold their house, unable to live with the memories it held, and moved out of state to start a new life.